Welcome, wrestling fans, to the Pro Wrestle Machine. We've got a jam-packed episode for you. Get ready to dive into wrestling's rich history, packed with insights, opinions, and a few surprises. And remember, you can skip to your favorite moments with our chapter markers. Let's jump right into it. March 6, 2000 Observer Newsletter, Mick Foley retires, WWF No Way Out Review. By Dave Meltzer. Unlike most other wrestlers of similar fame, to do a career retrospective on Mick Foley is best saved for an examination probably years down the road. He was the classic overachiever, who defied all the odds, and was possibly the single greatest influence inside the ring on styles changing in the business of the past 10 years. In a career destined because he wasn't that great athletically and didn't have what was believed to be the right look and physique, for being mid-card for life, he ended up when his career came to a close, as one of the 5 biggest stars in North America, and even as a best-selling author. In the end, he went out with the glory but without the storyline ego, putting over the world champion twice on pay-per-view in his own specialty matches, and even in a tag match on television, and in every angle over the final weeks of his career. Hunter Hearst Helmsley long since earned his spot as the top heel in the industry today, but if he is remembered someday as one of the top heels in history, he owes a lot of it to the credibility Foley gave him these last 2 months. In many ways, from hard work, to unselfishness about making others look good, to being a student of the game and probably truly loving pro wrestling more than nearly anyone else, enough to give his body, and perhaps parts of his brain, to it willingly and happily, whether big money was involved or not, and not for the selfish glory of bragging about scars in the bar to get over to nobody, but more to satisfy his own vision of what he wanted his role in something greater to him this business to be. He should be admired like few if any wrestlers of our generation. The fact he was able to achieve his level of success without developing the star attitude that the majority of people who have it do develop, and the quality of the book he wrote, speaks volumes for him as a person. But, as everyone knows, this story is not without a dark side. Because of his inventiveness, coming up with dangerous ways for a guy who should blend into the crowd to get noticed by the crowd, the business is far more dangerous. Injuries are more plentiful and more severe than at any time. This can't be blamed on him, as these trends were going to happen anyway. But it was his success, not someone in ECW like Sabu who never performed them on a national stage, that became the wrestler who inspired a large percentage of teenagers over the past 3 years that felt they were never going to have the body to be a pro wrestler, or the athletic ability, felt they could emulate him and hey, he's still alive, walking around. And he's a superstar. Maybe he moves a little slow, but living proof that you can do these things, and get up from them, and the stardom people not all that unlike Mick Foley some 20 years ago, but probably with nowhere near his passion or verbal ability, may come their way. And Foley did it without ending up as a zombie on painkillers. But nobody else in this profession is like him. Few are born with the mental toughness and ability to absorb pain, but he's going to be testing that capacity for the rest of his life. Few truly love the business and the history of the business, to do these things for an actual reason of being one of the legends in an industry that cares nothing about yesterday's legends. And most important, maybe 1 or 2 were smart and entertaining enough to come up with characters and more so interviews that were the difference from being Balls Mahoney to being Cactus Jack. But if this living proof that a human body can survive all this winds up like a financially set version of Tom Billington, the truth is the fans will care just as much as they do today about Tom Billington. Nobody knows the end result of this story today. Billington abused his body in far more ways than just taking bumps, but he also never took the risks with his brain when it comes to severe head shots. And if the end of the story about Foley isn't as nice as everyone hopes, will the business that Billington and Foley changed will revert back to what it was before based on lessons learned? Just like it did because of lessons learned by the end result of Billington, or as quickly as the physiques changed when the truth came out about Wayne Coleman years before Billington. With or without Foley, the people in this profession will end up just as they always have. A few success stories and far more broken down and bitter. More broken down than in the past. And for the dozens who make it, far better off financially. Foley, after injuries, turned him into largely a comedy figure, and a very successful one at that. For the last 6 months of 1999, decided he would go out with matches that would fit his legacy. So he put his body on the line and did things that most wrestlers in far better health wouldn't do in the wildest dreams, and pulled out 2 excellent matches and maybe an even better interview in his final weeks as a full-time active competitor. If he does retire, few if any ever went out in such a blaze of glory. The Foley legacy overshadowed everything else on the WWF's No Way Out pay-per-view show on February 27 at the Hartford, Connecticut Civic Center. Either he got the title from Hunter Hearst Helmsley in the Hell in the Cell cage that will always be remembered in the same vision as himself, or it would be his last match. Based on Foley's emotionally charged interview that aired 2 nights earlier, he would have had to have been the greatest actor this business has ever produced if he wasn't going to lose the match. And he was good enough as an actor that the finish was still far from a certainty in most people's eyes. He left doing 2 major stunts similar to the ones he did at what will go down as his more famous Hell in the Cell match on June 28, 1998 in Pittsburgh. He did a backwards fall through the Spanish announcer's table while hanging onto the top of the cage, a legitimate 13 to 14 foot drop, probably about 6 feet less than the first fall in Pittsburgh. He did a second, heavily gimmicked reprise of the far more dangerous move from the original match, falling through the gimmick part of cage, taking a perfect flat back bump into a gimmick section of the ring that broke. Unlike the first match, where he suffered numerous serious injuries that he will wake up to for the rest of his life, he didn't seem terribly the worse for wear, at least by his own standards, after his last match. But even so, the risks were there if he had made a bad landing from either fall. It should be noted that almost no pro wrestler in modern history has had a much ballyhooed retirement and hasn't come back. Antonio Inoki, of all people, is the only one in modern times of major stars that looks to have kept their word and probably will never come back simply due to his age. Riki Choshu hasn't come back yet, but it appears he is going to at some point. Some, like Foley's mentor, Terry Funk, have retired so many times it's gone from a much anticipated return, to an anticipated and even amazing comeback, to a nice storyline but certainly no longer amazing comeback, to a story that started to get sad, to one that ended up even sadder, seeing a legend, who still at points shows signs of his greatness, hang on far too long, only to be abused both legacy-wise and physically at every turn by a company and in an industry and by modern fans that have no respect for earned status and only cares what you've done for me today. Unlike Funk, who has had numerous chances, from the 1983 farewell in Japan, which was the most emotional scene maybe ever at a pro wrestling event, to the 1989 New York Knockout, another retirement match which may have been the best match of his career, or his 1997 Amarillo farewell against Bret Hart, to even a Raw match against Foley as late as 1999, which was a 4-stars television match. To go out with a bang, he always came back. And whether it'll be a forgotten 3 minutes Nitro match or even worse, some house show in Duluth before 2,000 people, most of whom have no clue as to who Terry Funk really is, or if he stays after this run, on some indie show in Tuscaloosa, Alabama before 200 fans, his last match will most likely not be the spectacular send-off he deserves. In many ways, Foley delivered the closest thing to the equivalent to Funk's 1989 New York Knockout performance, not as great technically, but due to the interviews and the stunts, probably stronger emotionally. Foley decreed in his interview taped 5 nights earlier he wasn't going to be one of those people who came back and promised he would never wrestle again. At the same time, and it's far too soon to know if this will materialize, as he said, this is the pro wrestling business. Foley himself has talked about possibly coming back for one match, although at no point soon, as has the promotion. By the nature of the interviews leading to his exit, the perfect fit would be to do an angle before next year's WrestleMania, which would be more than a year later, and while it wouldn't exactly keep to the stipulation, by pro wrestling standards, it wouldn't make a mockery of them either. Based on his closing storyline about never main eventing a WrestleMania, it seems like they are setting the stage for a big angle next year so he can make that a final match after more than 1 year to rest up. He'll only be 35. It's not like he'd be too old, and with a year to rest up, he'd probably feel a lot better physically than he has in a long time. The plans for now seem to be to keep Foley off television for a few weeks, and have him return to TV in the closing weeks to play a part, but not as an in-ring participant, at this year's WrestleMania. Whether he'll be commissioner, which has been talked about a lot, or play some other role, isn't fully determined. Paced by the strong main event, this was one of the better WWF pay-per-view shows in recent memory, drawing a sellout 12,551, paying $451,625 and another $97,126 in merchandise. The show was filled with surprises, the biggest being Big Show pinning Rock with the help of Shane McMahon, one of 2 finishes that stunned the crowd, which seemed sure the faces were going over in both of the final matches. It seems almost certain that Helmsley vs. Rock is still the WrestleMania main event, but with 5 weeks to go, they figure they can throw some more stipulations out there to get Rock over Show for the slot, or if necessary, make it a 3-way, although in this case, without Foley and with Show, a 3-way clearly hurts the match. There were a few late changes in the show due to injuries. Billy Gunn suffered a ligament tear in his rotator cuff and further rotator cuff damage 5 days before the show and needed surgery from his match in Nashville with Bubba Ray Dudley. He came back to drop the belts and do the angle to tell a story as to why he was injured and needed surgery. The plan is for him to be operated by Dr. James Andrews in Birmingham within the next week or two, and preliminary estimates have him out of action about 3 months. That's the reason the tag title match was kept short and he was largely kept out of the ring, since he was working with one arm. Bob Holly suffered torn rib cartilage taking a Samoan drop and landing wrong on February 23 in Little Rock, Arkansas against Rikishi and will be out for a while. The planned three-way for the hardcore title with himself, Crash Holly and Test was pulled from the show. 1. Kurt Angle pinned Chris Jericho, Chris Irvine, in 10-14 to win the IC title. Angle took a high backdrop over the top and Jericho used his springboard dropkick knocking Angle off the apron. Jericho did a moonsault block off the ring steps and ended up connecting with a knee to Angle's chest. Angle went for a Frankensteiner, but it was blocked by Jericho into a powerbomb. They did a couple of submission reversals out of that Japanese style, but the fans didn't understand what they were doing. Jericho then kicked out of Angle's reverse fireman's carry slam. Angle grabbed the title belt, but as he went to use it the first time, ref Tim White grabbed it from him and Jericho put him in the walls of Jericho, but Angle made the ropes. After a ref bump, Angle grabbed the belt. Chyna was also bumped by a collision with Angle. In the ring, Jericho went for the quebrada, but Angle stuck the belt up and it hit Jericho and White counted to 3. After the match, ref Earl Hebner came out to tell White what had happened, but he didn't care and let the decision stand. 3 stars. 2. The Damn Dudleys, Mark LaMonica and Devin Hughes, won the WWF Tag Titles from the New Age Outlaws, Brian James and Monty Sopp, in 5:20. Fans in Hartford chanted ECW loudly at the start. Due to his injury, Billy Gunn was rarely in, but he did do a famouser on Devon, but Bubba broke up the pin, pulling Gunn out. Bubba hit Gunn in the shoulder with a pipe. After a ref bump, there will be a lot of those before this one is over. They did a 3D on Road Dogg and Bubba pinned him for the title switch, which got a big face pop. Dogg was mad at Gunn for not breaking up the pin and they teased a problem. Match was better than you'd think, particularly with one of the guys really working with a handicap. 2.5. 3. Mark Henry pinned Viscera, Nelson Frazier Jr., in 3:47. Jim Ross at the onset said this match wasn't going to be worth many stars. There was no heat, even with the strong angles they played. The fans chanted boring loudly within seconds. Both guys worked hard, and it was better than it figured to be, particularly with both guys working with a handicap. They stink. Mae Young did a run-in. She's still pregnant, by the way. Viscera shoved her down and set up to splash her, but Henry stopped him with a shoulder block and pinned him with a body slam. Most of the finish didn't air due to satellite transmission trouble. You could joke getting just the radio version of what was happening from Lawler and Ross was better than actually seeing it, but the finish wasn't really that bad. 1/4 star. 3. Christian, Jay Resso and Edge, Adam Copeland, became #1 contenders for the WWF Tag Titles, beating Matt and Jeff Hardy in 15-18. The storyline was that Terry Runnels returned, and she's dropped more weight as well since her rib showing is even more pronounced than Francine's. Aside from the plants, it looked like her skin was literally stretched over nothing but bones. Anyway, she asked the acolytes for help, so they were at ringside. This was a good match, but actually a little disappointing since it couldn't compare to many of their previous encounters. Part of it was the crowd was less into it than you'd expect. Christian did his dive early. Jeff did a Frankensteiner and caught his head on the mat on the bottom. Edge did one of the highest power bombs on Jeff on record. The Hardys did their combination splash and leg drop off the top double on Christian. Edge spread Jeff. Matt used a diamond cutter, which neither announcer would give a name for. Runnels then turned on the Hardys, shoving Jeff off the top rope, and he did an incredible bump crashing onto the barricade. She then slapped Matt, who turned around and was pinned by Christian with the Resso. Runnels then went to congratulate Edge and Christian, who acted as if they didn't have any knowledge this was coming. The Hardys confronted Runnels, but the acolytes ran in as her protectors and pounded on them, leaving them laying. Farouk somehow nearly lost Jeff on a Dominator, having a terrible time getting him up, and then dropping him on his head. They also teased problems with Edge and Christian, as Christian didn't want the win due to Runnels turning on the Hardys, while Edge took the tact of they were getting a tag title shot and you take wins in wrestling any way you get them. 3 stars. 5. Taz, Peter Inertia, beat Big Boss Man, Ray Traylor, by a DQ in 47. There was no match. Prince Albert ran in for the DQ immediately. The post-match story was that the two guys continued to pound Taz into the ground, but he kept grabbing single legs and tried to keep fighting, including even after Bossman broke a gimmick nightstick on his head and even after Albert kicked him low. Dud. 6. X-Pac, Sean Waltman, beat Kane, Glenn Jacobs, in a no DQ match in 7:49. X-Pac did his best singles pay-per-view match in a long time carrying Kane, who was working with a pulled groin. A lot of brawling. X-Pac used a garbage can. Kane threw the steps into the ring. X-Pac hit Kane with the ring bell. Paul Bearer jumped X-Pac and Tori slapped Bearer. It was really funny seeing Bearer then chase Tori around the ring. No, he never caught her. In fact, even though Bearer has lost a ton of weight, he still blew up probably after less than 30 feet of running. Kane was on the top and X-Pac hit him with a high dropkick and Bronco Buster. He set up the X-Factor but Kane stood up. Kane hit a clothesline off the top but Tori then distracted Kane. Kane choke slammed X-Pac and Tori distracted him again. He tombstoned Tori, which didn't get nearly the pop the second time. Kane picked up the steps but X-Pac dropkicked the steps, causing Kane to lose balance with the steps falling on him and X-Pac held the steps down on his shoulders for the pin. 2 3/4. 7. Too Cool, Brian Lawler and Scott Taylor, and Rikishi Fatu Solifafatu defeated Chris Benoit and Perry Saturn, Perry Sotelo, and Dean Malenko, Dean Simon, in 12:41. Rikishi hit Eddie Guerrero in the bad elbow with the pipe brought in by Guerrero, which seemed to be something already done in the show. There was a great spot where Scotty 2 Hotty tried the worm and Malenko smacked him. Some solid wrestling. Rikishi finally made the hot tag and piledrove Saturn to set up the worm spot. Grandmaster did the leg drop off the top on Saturn but no ref. Benoit did the diving headbutt on Sexay. The finish got confusing with everyone everywhere, but it left Rikishi and Malenko in the ring and Rikishi scored the clean pin with a pile driver and Banzai. 3 stars. 8. Big Show, Paul White, pinned Rock, Dwayne Johnson, in 7:29 to supposedly earn the title shot at WrestleMania. Show is looking more and more like the Big Slow. It wasn't much of a match but it had a surprise finish. Another ref bump by Earl Hebner. Show hit the choke slam and Tim White ran into count but Hebner pulled him out of the ring. As White and Hebner rolled around on the floor, No Chance in Hell played to a huge babyface pop. Shane McMahon came out. Rock hit the rock bottom and went for the people's elbow when McMahon threw a chair in his face and ref White counted the fall. 1 3/4. Throughout the show they had scenes of Angle celebrating the IC title win with fans. The funny part of all this was that every fan in these scenes was celebrating with him. It wound up in the parking lot where Jericho and Chyna jumped him and threw him in the trunk of a car. 9. Hunter Hearst Helmsley, Paul Levesque, pinned Cactus Jack, Michael Foley, in 23:59 in the Hell in the Cell match in Foley's retirement match to retain the WWF title. It should be mentioned right up front that Jim Ross did an amazing job getting over the drama of this match. It also should be mentioned that the cameras did a zoom in on 12 fans holding up lettering of Foley Will Die. I'm not sure which was sadder, the 12 fans who thought it was cool to hold it up, or the director who thought it was cool to show those fans. Foley seemingly gave everything he had and more than made up for the fact physically he can't do that much. He got his knees whipped hard into the steps, had the steps thrown at his head and then Triple H pounded on the steps with a chair. Foley used a chair for a low blow and a double-arm DDT on the chair and a leg sweep on the chair for near falls. Triple H used a drop toe hold on the chair. He smashed Foley's head into the cage many times. However, Triple H bladed first after being catapulted into the cage. Foley grinded Triple H's head on the cage and hip-tossed him into the cage. He came off the middle rope with a chair, taking a hard bump on his hip, to the floor. It should also be mentioned they had about a dozen padlocks on the cage to theoretically prevent them from escaping and going to the top. Finally, the gimmick section of the side of the cage was opened and Foley shoulder blocked himself through it, and then bladed his arm big time and threw Triple H out. He piledrove Triple H on a table that again didn't break. Foley tried to climb the cage but Stephanie McMahon pulled him down. Foley grabbed a barbed wire board he had stashed at ringside and Triple H ran away, but Foley hit him with it. Triple H climbed the cage to escape. Foley climbed the cage but Triple H got the barbed wire board and hit him with it, and Foley took the bump through the Spanish announcer's table and bladed. Foley kept trying to throw a chair to the top of the cage but was legitimately physically battered to the point he couldn't get it up there and whatever spots were planned with it must have been nixed. The cameras pulled away from the action, probably due to fear he really was hurt since he couldn't throw the chairs. He climbed the cage and they fought with the barbed wire board and took bumps on the reinforced parts of the cage including a suplex and a DDT. Foley set the board on fire, but the fire never was part of the match other than the visual. He then took a backdrop onto the gimmicked part of the cage. They had done a run-through of what piece was gimmicked, etc. on February 23rd, and Foley went through, taking the bump perfectly. As the match went on, while everyone was looking at them on top of the cage, they had workers underneath, gimmicking the section of the ring under the cage, removing the board so he could fall on a mattress-like surface and not be injured. Nevertheless, any bad angle from that height, even on a mattress, could have been scary. Foley sold the fall huge, got hit with the pedigree and was pinned. The stretcher came out, but as per his interview, he got up and left on his own power with tears in his eyes. 4.5 stars. So with all the problems in trying to choose a most important wrestler of the century, the choice is Kim Shinraku. There are plenty of arguments that can be made for various candidates detailed in last week's issues for different candidates. Luthez had the amazing longevity and tremendous credibility worldwide and was the main in-ring performer that carried the National Wrestling Alliance to being the most powerful entity as an umbrella group for promoters around the world in the history of the industry. Hulk Hogan was the biggest worldwide celebrity of all and a fantastic drawing card. There has never been a performer day in and day out inside the ring over nearly 3 decades better than Ric Flair. Frank Gotch was the greatest American historical figure in wrestling, and Strangler Lewis was a national celebrity before there was television to make it easy. And Antonio Inoki, within his home country, was a bigger deal than Hogan, Thez, or Flair ever were. And then there's Rikidozan. Rikidozan was Japan's first pro wrestling superstar. He was by far the biggest television star ever in pro wrestling, and maybe the biggest television star ever in Japanese culture. He took an industry that didn't exist and turned it and himself into the first big television hit. He created an industry that has had its ups and downs but has never gone away, and also never, for better or worse, strayed from the sometimes strange values he instilled in it from his own life in sumo. He was the man who personally picked the 2 men who carried the ball, Shohei Baba and Kanji Inoki, after his death in Japan, and the man, Kentaro Oki, who became the biggest wrestling star ever in Korea. And his end came in a spectacular mob-style murder at the age of 39. In a country that at the time hated Koreans, he was one of the country's biggest celebrities and most popular sports heroes. And thus his birthplace and background were always hidden. His life story was a myth, just like the world he learned from the Americans and exported to Japan, and made it bigger than any of the Americans ever dreamed it could be. According to Japanese history, Rikidozan was born Mitsuhiro Momoto on November 14, 1924 in the city of Omura, near Nagasaki, the site of the atomic bomb dropping in 1945. The reality is that his name at birth was Kim Shinraku, and he was born in North Korea. The plight of a native of the Nagasaki area being the cultural figure a decade after Japan was devastated by Americans in a war that left casualties and spread cancer for generations throughout that city, fighting back against larger American imports became a television drama that was a huge hit in prime time for more than 30 years and remains a huge spectator sport today. Unlike the rest of the world, where as time went on, wrestling got more and more cartoonish and gimmick-oriented, with fancy costumes and unbelievable storylines, the world Rikidozan created of worked serious sport with almost a sumo-like hierarchy and slow promotion to the top still exists today. In the 2 major promotions of Japan, while the moves have gotten flashier and the matches faster-paced, the basic themes remain within the realm of athletic believability, and the real outlandish gimmickry is generally saved for the smaller independents just looking for attention and aren't considered major league. Unlike in the United States, where the general public for decades dismissed pro wrestlers as phonies, and more recently gave them credit as cartoonish entertainers, in Japan, even though the matches are worked, the wrestlers were always regarded as great athletes and tough fighters who do worked wrestling matches that sometimes become real. While America's first television stars were gimmick-oriented Gorgeous George or barefoot acrobatic Argentina Rocca, Japan's original television superstar was a powerfully built man in long black tights and black boots, forever wearing the old international heavyweight title belt. While Japan is not immune from the cyclical ups and downs of business, this concept of wrestling has led to more years than not, Japan being the strongest economic market for pro wrestling for most of the past half-century. At his peak, it was larger as part of the general public culture than modern recorded pro wrestling has probably been anywhere and at any time. Even to this day, nearly 40 years after his death, his name is known by everyone in Japan. His grave site in Tokyo is practically a national monument where wrestlers go to get their photos taken. And at the turn of the century, he finished number 14 in a Japanese newspaper poll for Man Not Athlete but Man of the Century. On many television and media retrospectives of the century in Japan, clippings of his early television wrestling matches were featured. Gorgeous George, his American equivalent as a television wrestling pioneer, died the same year as Rikidozan, and today the name is only known outside the hardest core wrestling fans to people past the age of 55 or to current wrestling fans as a brief memory of one of the million interchangeable silicon babes that appeared on TV wrestling over the past year. Kim Shinraku's Japanese life actually started with an older brother, who was a big sumo fan growing up as part of a poor family in Korea. His brother left Japan for Korea to become a sumo, and Kim followed at the age of 15. He was christened Rikidozan as his sumo gimmick name, and at first in sumo was even billed from Korea, a fact later hidden in the media as he became popular in pro wrestling after the Korean War. From all accounts, he was a very tough and powerful man and was one of the top sumo wrestlers in the world, which in those days made him already something of a household name in Japan. When he wasn't promoted to the rank of Grand Champion or Yokozuna in sumo, which may have been the strange sumo customs in those days regarding not elevating foreigners to the almost godlike ranks reserved for those native-born, he complained and was forced out in May 1950. After incurring racism in Japan after leaving sumo, he worked in construction and changed his name to Mitsuhiro Momota. Japanese pro wrestling can trace its roots to when Masahiko Kimura, a Japanese judo champion, the same Masahiko Kimura famous in mixed martial arts for beating Hélio Gracie before 20,000 fans in Brazil in 12 minutes via submission in the early 50s, and Toshio Yamaguchi went to the United States and wrestled in San Francisco against Mike and Ben Sharp for the World Tag Team Championship in 1951. On September 30, 1951, Bobby Bruins, a famous wrestling booker of that period, ran an American tour of Japan using Kimura and Yamaguchi as his native stars, at the old Tokyo Memorial Hall. Hawaiian Harold Sakata, who later wrestled as Odd Job Tosh Togo and was more famous in the US in the 60s as an actor playing Japanese roles, in particular for a cough syrup commercial where he karate chopped through tables, and for a role in the James Bond movie Goldfinger for his magic hat, who had won a silver medal in weightlifting at the 1948 Olympics, was the big star. They also brought in Joe Louis to referee on some of the big shows on the tour. Sakata recruited the recently retired sumo, who had a big sports name in the country, to see his first pro wrestling show. They started training him in basics. Just weeks later, on October 28, 1951 in the same building, Rikidozan made his pro wrestling debut going to a 10-minute draw against Bruins. Bruins signed him to a full-time contract and took him overseas to teach him wrestling and get publicity out to create a hand-picked Japanese wrestling native hero. He left Japan in early 1952 to train under Okishikina in Hawaii, debuting by pinning Chief Little Wolf in a preliminary match at the Honolulu Civic Auditorium. He was promoted fast. On March 14, 1952, he teamed with Killer Davis to win the Pacific Ocean Tag Team titles from Bruins and Lucky Simonovic. A few months later he was sent to the mainland, promoted from the start as a superstar. He debuted on June 12, 1952 in San Francisco, beating Ike Aikens. Just 2 weeks after his mainland arrival he was in the main event at the Cow Palace on June 23, 1952, teaming with Primo Carnera to battle the Sharp brothers to a 60-minute draw for the World Tag Team titles. 3 days later in the same city, he suffered his first pro loss to Leo Nomelini, one of the greatest linebackers in NFL history and a superstar with the San Francisco 49ers, who was one of the biggest names in pro wrestling during the offseason. That loss was done as part of a long-term plan as word was sent to Japan about Rikidozan's loss to the football superstar via the old UPI wire service, with both the story of the loss and that Rikidozan had become a sensation in San Francisco and when he returned to Japan, was going to start an American-style pro wrestling company. In his first year wrestling in the United States, he wrestled 260 matches, losing only 5 singles bouts to Nomelini, Tom Rice, and Fred Atkins, and was on the losing end of 2 tag bouts challenging the Sharp brothers. The Japan Pro Wrestling Association was officially announced on July 6, 1953, and its first show was on July 18 in Osaka, but those shows are really not referred to much in Japanese history. On November 29 of that year in Honolulu, they held a tournament for a challenger for a match against world champion Lou Thesz the next week. Rikidozan won, and had his first singles world title match on December 6, 1953 in Honolulu, and was pinned by Thesz back suplex, which is why, even to this day, the back suplex means so much more in Japan than the United States, and why Jumbo Tsuruta used it as his main finisher in the 80s. What is remembered as the beginnings of Japanese pro wrestling were 3 nights in 1954, February 19th, 20th and 21st at the old Tokyo Sumo Hall at Kuromai. What wasn't important was the venue, but all 3 shows were sellouts to see this novelty sport headlined by a Japanese former sumo who had gone to the United States and beaten most of the best that country had to offer on their own turf. What was important is that television, then in its infancy in Japan, as at that point in time they were far behind the US technologically, agreed to broadcast all 3 shows, the first night on NHK, and the next 2 nights on NTV. The first night, Rikidozan and Kimura went to a draw against the Sharp Brothers for the NWA World Tag Team titles, and the Rikidozan phenomenon was born. Images burned in the mind of most of the country of Rikidozan, making the hot tag, chopping the two gigantic. The Sharps were 6'6" and 6'7" in an era when no athletes Japanese had ever seen were that tall. Americans, who were actually Canadian, and them selling his offense big. Virtually nobody in the TV audience had ever even seen pro wrestling, and they didn't understand the first thing about it, but were enthralled by seeing a famous native athlete from their traditional national sport beating up on Americans much taller than he was. The basis of Japanese wrestling for decades was created that first night on television. The fans had a hero to stand up to the big Americans who beat them in a war and left them poor and hungry. This created the fascination in Japan with big powerful American stars. And that's why people like Scott Norton, even to this day, can be wrestling stars in Japan. There are news clippings from the time showing people, since few households at the time actually had television, when reading about this first night in the newspapers, looking in department store windows, and thousands gathering in parks that had television sets watching Rikidozan fight the next 2 nights on NTV, which has continued to broadcast pro wrestling almost weekly for more than 4 decades. This led to a rush on people buying television sets, specifically to see Rikidozan beat up big foreigners, and he became the national hero who in many ways popularized television in that country. On the second tour, on August 10, 1954 in Osaka, Rikidozan and Kikichi Endo beat Leo Shoulders Newman and Hans Schnabel to win the Pacific Ocean Tag Team Championship, the first title change on Japanese television. This led to the biggest match in the short history of Japanese pro wrestling, and still a legendary battle today. On December 22, 1954 at Sumo Hall, billed as Sumo vs. Judo, Rikidozan vs. Kimura to create the first Japanese heavyweight wrestling champion. The agreement ahead of time was that this match would be a draw, but the end result was that Rikidozan, in the middle of a worked match, suddenly double-crossed Kimura and started shooting, and started throwing the most brutal kicks and chops to a stunned Kimura, beating him senseless, including stomping hard on the head of his stunned foe. Kimura was eventually knocked out from a brutal blow to the head, and the doctors stopped the match. As often happens in this business, an unprofessional act of epic proportions creates a superstar of almost mythic proportions of the man who violated the basic tenets of the business. Pro wrestling had and still does have this weird long tradition of people benefiting from double-crossing people in a cowardly act. One could argue that Rikidozan did have guts to jump Kimura, since at the time he was believed to have been the equivalent of a UFC champion, and legend at the time labeled him the toughest real fighter in the world. In those days, with no true venues to prove it, any title like that is more the stuff of legend, but he was a legitimate judo world champion. But Rikidozan was a bigger man, and in any fight, when you get to jump and pound and blow after blow on someone not defending themselves and who doesn't even know he's in a fight until it's too late, it's pretty hard to come back. Rikidozan was also president of the company, called the Japanese Wrestling Alliance, starting the trend where the biggest star in the ring would also run the company outside the ring, which also lasted for decades. Atsuma Fuji, a sumo grand champion, was then recruited into pro wrestling as Rikidozan's partner, and they went to Honolulu on April 17, 1955, beating Bruins and Sumanovich to win the Hawaiian Tag Team title. The two sumos became a touring act, popular throughout Asia, particularly in India, for 9 weeks. The Japanese title he created 11 months earlier was dropped in lieu of creating an Asian heavyweight title, and he imported 450-pound King Kong, former Olympic Games wrestling medalist Emil Zaya, who was at the time the superstar pro wrestler of Singapore and Hong Kong, to put him over on November 22, 1955 at Sumo Hall. 1 week after Rikidozan suffered a defeat in a tag team match teaming with Sakata against King Kong and Tiger Jokinder Singh, which is probably why a generation later Tigerjeet Singh was able to have so much success in Japan. At the end of January 1956, they started building for the big one. Slowly. Although he had never wrestled in Japan, Thez was already famous there for not only being the elusive NWA World Heavyweight Champion, but for pinning Rikidozan, something the Japanese had never seen before, in the deciding fall of a match, in Honolulu. Rikidozan's promotion officially joined the NWA when he flew to St. Louis to make the deal with Sam Mushnick, to get dates on Thez, and build for the biggest series of 2 matchups to that point in the recorded history of the industry. The year 1956 saw Rikidozan capture his first world title, as on May 4, 1956 at Osaka Furitsu Gym, Rikidozan used his trademark finisher of the hard chops, a judo whip, a body slam and kick, drop kick and flying head scissors into a pin, winning the NWA World Tag Team titles with Kikichi Endo as his partner, beating the Sharp Brothers. The reign was short as on May 19, 1956 in Sapporo, the Sharp brothers, through pinning HENDO, got the titles back and returned to San Francisco with them. He also got to avenge his 1953 loss to Tom Rice, as on August 1, 1956 in Tokyo. He pinned Rice to win the Pacific Coast title, but immediately vacated the title. By 1957, the novelty of pro wrestling was starting to fade, and business was bad when Rikidozan would leave on foreign tours. The novelty of bringing in Bobo Brazil, the first black superstar to come to Japan, picked up business big. On April 30th of that year, they announced, 5 months in advance, that finally the champ was coming to Tokyo. In what was undoubtedly the most watched pro wrestling match in history up to that point, on October 6, 1957 at Korakuen Baseball Stadium before 27,000 fans, Thesz and Rikidozan went to a 60-minute draw and a 2 out of 3 fall match with neither man winning a fall. The show drew an 87.0 rating, the largest TV rating pro wrestling is believed to have ever done anywhere in the world at any time. Rikidozan had several other matches, including one the next week, that did better than 60.0 ratings and to this day are among the top 10 most watched television shows in the history of Japan. When he died in 1963, almost all of the most watched TV shows in the history of the country were his wrestling matches. What that basically means is that nearly everyone alive in the country on that day saw the first Thesz match. A rematch on October 13, 1957 at the Osaka Ogi Pool drew 30,000 fans to see them go another 60 minutes with each man winning 1 fall. Thesz returned to the United States, seeing what Rikidozan had created, and wanted to cultivate the feud and make it stronger, and eventually dropped the NWA World title to him because he felt the money-making possibilities were well beyond what wrestlers could ever earn in the United States. When the Alliance, and in particular Mushnick, who only understood America and didn't see what was happening and the potential of the new market, wouldn't agree to the idea of letting their champion leave the country more frequently and eventually doing a title trade, Thesz shockingly resigned as champion after 8 years. The Alliance asked him to drop the title to Buddy Rogers. He refused, citing his well-known dislike for Rogers, and handpicked Dick Hutton, a great real wrestler that he had great personal respect for, and the title change took place November 14, 1957 in Toronto. But replacing the well-known Thesz with the uncharismatic Hutton hurt the championship, and the NWA in general greatly, causing major promotions to leave, form splinter groups, and create new champions. Thesz, free from NWA commitments in the United States, used his name value from years as champion to book himself around the world, billing himself as NWA International Heavyweight Champion. On August 27, 1958 at the Olympic Auditorium in Los Angeles, Rikidozan beat Thesz in 2 out of 3 falls and brought the International Heavyweight title to Japan, where it remained for some 14 years as the most prestigious title belt in Japanese wrestling. That belt, which he held until his death more than 5 years later, still exists today as part of the Triple Crown title. Business went way up with Rikidozan returning after having finally pinned Thesz in the United States. To the Japanese, beating Thesz, the god of pro wrestling, was a bigger deal by that point than beating Hutton, who was an unknown. His first feud with Don Leo Jonathan in October was a huge success. But business fell in November when Rikidozan left for Brazil. During this down period, the idea for the World League Tour, which still exists today in all Japan as the annual Champion Carnival every spring, came about. The first World League, in 1959, was another huge success, selling out every show and drawing huge television ratings, particularly for the appearance of a huge masked man, Mr. Atomic, Clyde Steves. The tournament ended on June 16, 1959 with Rikidozan pinning Jesse Ortega, in a match famous because it was the first major blood match in Japan. He brought Mr. Atomic back for a huge match on August 7, 1959 at the Old Deanan Coliseum, where he pinned him to keep the international title. While touring Brazil once again in March of 1960, Rikidozan heard about a Japanese high school boy who had migrated with his family and was living in Brazil that was a huge track star. The previous year, at the age of 16, he was the Brazilian national high school champion in the shot put and the discus. Rikidozan found Kanji Inoki and recruited both he and the tallest man ever to play Major League Baseball in Japan, Shohei Baba, into pro wrestling to be the 2 biggest stars after he stepped down. Baba was the chosen one from the start and had a path paved much easier for him by Rikidozan. Rikidozan won the second World League tournament pinning Nomalini on May 13, 1960. Rikidozan then, starting his grooming for the future, elevated Toyonobori to the top level. He recreated the All-Asian Tag Team titles and gave them to Danny Miller and Frank Valois, and on June 7, 1960 in Nagoya, he and Toyonobori captured the belts, winning 2 straight falls, and they became the main event tag team, dominating the belts until his death. He also had one of his biggest career feuds with Sonny Myers. He imported Tex McKenzie, who at 6'8", was one of the tallest headliners in pro wrestling at the time, with plans for a big feud. But McKenzie didn't like taking Rikidozan's chops, and the two never got along, and instead a former University of California football star was given the name Prince Iaukia, later known as King Curtis Iaukia, and he became his big rival as 1960 came to a close. But the biggest show, in hindsight, of the year was on September 30th of that year at the Daido Gym in Tokyo. The main event saw Rikidozan retain his All-Asian title going to a draw with Ricky Waldo. On the undercard, Baba made his debut, pinning Yanataro Tanaka, and Inoki, later Antonio Inoki, made his debut losing to Oki. The Third World League in 1961 was built around the creation of two new foreign monster superstars, the 6'5", 450-pound Great Antonio and an ever-better big masked man than Mr. Atomic, in Mr. X, Big Bill Miller. Before the tour opened, they had a television demonstration which was covered in the news of the huge Antonio pulling 4 buses, totally 8 tons. When the tour began, every night was a sellout to see Antonio, who was used as a non-tournament special attraction winning short squash-style matches, thus didn't have to do singles matches against the top wrestlers, from the strength demonstration. Antonio got such a big head and was bullying and harassing people everywhere he went, that he didn't even last the tour. Rikidozan ended the feud right away, beating Antonio on June 2, 1961 at Sumo Hall in 2 straight falls, and was said to be unusually rough on him to punish him for being such an asshole on the tour. In the dressing room later, Carl Gotch and Miller took care of Antonio, and he was then fired and sent home. The tournament finals on June 29, 1961 in Osaka had a surprise finish, as in the third fall, Mr. X pinned Rikidozan doing the foreign object in the mask headbutt finish. However, the Great Togo told the referee and the decision was reversed, making Rikidozan the winner. This led to a mask versus international title match on July 21, 1961 at the Denon Coliseum in Tokyo, which Rikidozan won via count out and Miller's identity was revealed. Rikidozan was always involved with the Yakuza, the Japanese mob, as later came out after his death. They were a strong influence in funding not only wrestling, but in numerous other businesses, as Rikidozan was ahead of his time as an athlete who used his name to start other business ventures. He had his pro wrestling gym, a boxing gym, a golf course, a bowling alley, built mansions, apartment complexes, and opened a nightclub. He even announced he would be a boxing promoter and at his death was getting back into the sumo world. On February 3, 1962, Rikidozan and Toyonobori finally lost the All-Asian Tag Team title to Ricky Waldo and Luther Lindsay. It was the first major title loss for Rikidozan, and the Japanese, not used to seeing him lose a title match, rioted at the building. They quickly regained the belts on February 15. He then went to the United States to prepare for the World League tournament, saying that he wanted to unify and create one real world heavyweight champion, trying to bring all the different major world champions at the time, Pat O'Connor, NWA, Edward Carpentier, recognized in many areas, Fred Blassie, WWA, and Vern Gagne, AWA, along with top contenders like Bruno Sammartino and Buddy Rogers. But it never materialized. Before the tour started, Rikidozan cut a deal with Jules Strombo, who was part owner of the Los Angeles-based wrestling promotion out of the Olympic Auditorium, to buy a world championship belt that the NWA would never allow him to have. That promotion had also pulled out of the NWA a little earlier, creating its own world championship, held by Blassie. On March 28, 1962, Rikidozan won his first singles world heavyweight title, pinning Blassie at the Olympic Auditorium in Los Angeles. Blassie, who had never been to Japan, was promoted huge coming in for the World League tournament as the Vampire. Blassie did a tremendous job getting over his biting as his gimmick, filing his teeth, etc., and doing the best job of interviews the country had ever seen in the newspapers and on television, to where he immediately became the hottest heel ever to hit Japan. Most buildings for the tour sold out before the tour ever started after seeing Blassie filing his teeth at Haneda Airport on his arrival to regain his world title. Legend has it that Blassie bit Rikidozan's head in their first singles match, drawing blood, which shocked the Japanese public to the point that many people, the number having grown deep into double digits as the years went by and it became a typical pro wrestling tall story, had heart attacks watching on television. Of course, like with most legends, there is a germ of truth to it. On April 23, 1962 at Tokyo Gym, Rikidozan pinned Blassie to keep the title, but not before his was bloody from the biting to the forehead, which caused heat like Japanese wrestling had never seen before, but nobody died watching the match on television. It was actually 4 days later on a live television show from Kobe, where Thez and Mike Sharp and Blassie beat Rikidozan and Toyonobori and Great Togo, where the TV cameras showed close-ups of Blassie biting Togo's head, and the heavy juice shocked the nation, which is said to have caused 6 elderly men watching around the country to suffer heart attacks and pass away. Blassie, years later, when talking about the incident, used to brag and exaggerate that story into that he caused 93 Japanese to die during his career and complained he never reached his goal of 100. Rikitosen NTV and Japanese pro wrestling received their first major media criticism for the broadcasting of the close-ups of the biting and heavy blood which led to the deaths. The story about Japanese people dropping dead watching a wrestling match, credited to Blassie's biting, even got substantial media play at the time in the United States. But as it turned out, business and Blassie got even hotter, making him the hottest heel up to that point in Japanese wrestling. However, he was toned down from that point, and in the tournament finals on May 24, 1961 at the Tokyo Gym, Rikitosen pinned Thez in 2 of 3 falls. As per agreement, Rikitosen on July 26, 1962 went back to Los Angeles and dropped the WWA title to Blassie in a match that was stopped by referee Johnny Red Shoes Dugan due to Rikitosen's excessive bleeding from the biting. Rikitosen did his first injury angle in Japan in September, as newcomer Yukon Muskalak injured his right shoulder and he was kept out of action for 8 weeks, returning wearing pro football shoulder pads on the bad shoulder, on November 9, 1962 in Okinawa to beat Kalak in 2 straight falls in an international title match despite being unable to use his famous Rikitosen chops, and relied on nothing but kicking the entire match. Rikitosen opened the final year of his life announcing his engagement and a wedding date set for June 5, 1963. His final World League tour opened on March 23, 1963, which featured the return of Giant Baba, who had wrestled the previous few years in the United States as the first real Japanese wrestler to be a top-drawing main eventer almost everywhere in North America because of his size and unique physical appearance. On April 17, 1963 in Okinawa, he retained the international heavyweight title beating the allegedly 600-pound Haystacks Calhoun via count-out. I actually saw this match and it was so bad. And then in a completely different match 1 week later, retained the title pinning O'Connor, who was a great wrestler inside the ring. Finally, the tournament ended on May 17, 1963 at Tokyo Gym with Rikitosen pinning Killer Kowalski. But the big angle took place before the match even started, as the Destroyer, Dick Bayer, who came and billed as WWA champion, he had actually just lost the title prior to the tour to Blassie in Los Angeles. It was the match that made Destroyer for decades, including a stint as the first foreigner in history to become the regular tag team partner of a Japanese main eventer, the popular Baba and Destroyer tag team of the early 70s, and as one of the hosts of the most popular Japanese comedy shows of the 70s. It also made the figure 4 leg lock, which was a hot finisher for decades, before losing its luster in the 80s and being revived by Keiji Muto in 1995 in the Nobuhiko Takada Tokyo Dome match. And it was Rikitosen's only clean singles defeat ever in Japan, on May 19, 1963, when he lost a 1-fall match to the figure 4 leg lock in what was billed as a WWA title match. The shock of this loss led to the largest audience to ever watch a television show up to that point in time in Japan, a 67 rating. The Thez rating was higher, but by this point virtually every home in Japan had a television set, for the match 5 days later at the Tokyo Gym with the WWA title at stake. The best of 3 fall match ended in a 60 minutes draw. It's still the most watched match in Japanese history today, even beating out the Muhammad Ali vs. Antonio Inoki match in 1976. Rikitosen's wedding on June 5, 1963 was Japan's equivalent to the Lady Di wedding, more than 3,500 guests, featuring movie stars, major politicians, sports stars, company presidents and pop music stars, and he left for a world tour honeymoon. He already had a prior family, which included 2 sons who became pro wrestlers, Yoshihiro and Mitsuhiro Jr., Mitsuo, the latter of whom actually wrestled in the United States at one point as Rikitosen Jr. in Texas. But neither was able to capitalize on their father's fame. The latter of the 2 still works the comedy matches for All Japan and is still something of an internal power broker. Destroyer returned to Japan in December for the final matches of Rikitosen's life. By this point he was 39 years old, and was physically starting to deteriorate because of the years of drinking. Plus, with him running so many other businesses, it left him little time for any training, and so much of his emphasis was away from pro wrestling. It is generally conceded that Destroyer, who was a super worker by the standards of the time, a smaller heel, was the right opponent by this time because he needed a better athlete to help make the matches exciting. On December 2, 1963, Rikitosen kept the international title, winning 2 of 3 falls from Destroyer. 2 days later they had a 60 minutes draw. 2 days after that, Rikitosen and Toyonobori retained the All-Asian Tag Team titles, beating Destroyer and Buddy Austin. The next night in Hamamatsu, on the final wrestling card of the year, he worked in a six-man tag and took the train to Tokyo for a meeting with higher-ups in the Japanese Sumo Association. There was irony in the fact that they wanted Rikidozan, through his American pro wrestling contacts, to help them promote sumo wrestling in the United States. The irony was that he was basically kicked out of sumo, and not promoted due to his ethnicity, and years later, they came back to him when he was a superstar and asked for his help. On December 8, 1963, while partying with the sumo bigwigs at the Akasaka nightclub, in a gangland-style slaying, as legend has it, his assailant Katsuji Murata, a major player in a major mob family, peed on a knife, to ensure it would cause an infection. Rikidozan was on his way to the bathroom, and Murata was coming from the bathroom, and in the hallway, stabbed Rikidozan in the stomach. There was a conflict between two branches of mob gangs over who would control the promotion of pro wrestling as well as other entertainment events, and Rikidozan was aligned closely with the rival gang. As many wrestlers who had become huge babyface superstars in the Hogan, Rhodes vein, and none were ever bigger than Rikidozan, he actually believed he was all that. After being stabbed, Rikidozan beat up his assailant to an admiring mob of fans and threw him out of the club. He went to the stage, mentioned that he'd just been stabbed, and acted as if he wasn't even injured, and drank and danced the night away. Legend had him singing Mac the Knife on stage, which is also probably more myth than reality. But the failure to get immediate medical attention resulted in him contracting peritonitis, and all his years of drinking had done a number of some of his internal organs. At first the word was that he'd be fine, but a few days later he was forced to undergo major surgery, and on December 15, 1963, he died. And very nearly, so did the American entertainment form that he transported to Japan and made it bigger than the Americans, who invented it, ever could. He did not die an incredibly wealthy man, as much of the money he earned in wrestling and other businesses he squandered in gambling and booze. After his death, some of the truth about Rikidozan became public. His drinking, his mob connections, that the Yakuza was heavily involved in the pro wrestling business, and his other businesses, that he was an iron-fisted boss. It came out that the national sports hero wasn't so heroic in how he conducted his real-life business. But while it wasn't a top secret, it apparently wasn't the time to come out that Japan's sports hero was actually Korean, and that the matches he won before the large television audiences were actually fixed. Many of the major arenas refused to even allow pro wrestling shows. With its only real native drawing card gone and the business leaving the public with such a bad taste, the arenas that would book the shows didn't draw well. NTV, because pro wrestling had a track record of being so successful on television, didn't cancel, which kept pro wrestling barely alive, with Rikidozan's longtime second banana, Toyonobori, as the biggest star. But it was only 2 years later, when the JWA brought Giant Baba back and shot him past Toyonobori as the top star, and later the rise of Inoki, that the business got back on track with another boom period in the mid to late 60s. More than 20 books have been written about him since his death. There have been numerous television documentary retrospectives about him. During a later boom period 20 years after his death, similar in many ways to the current WWF boom in the United States, caused by the incredible popularity of Inoki, Riki Choshu, and Satoru Sayama, much like pro wrestling in the US in 1998-99, pro wrestling in Japan around 1982-83 was getting all the mainstream media ink. Unlike in the United States, Japan had real documented wrestling history, and it caused many articles in the media about this huge sports entertainment form and where it came from, and the answers to that question went right back to Rikidozan. It was at this point in time when the media and the country at large finally revealed the secret. That Japan's national hero when Japan as a nation started its comeback from the war, and who more than anyone else popularized the new medium of television, was actually not Japanese. But even today, while he may have been the biggest wrestling star that ever lived, virtually no wrestling fans even know the name of Kim Shinraku. Jim Thompson, an editorial assistant at the Detroit News, who did a pro wrestling column for the newspaper as well as a pro wrestling hotline, was charged on February 26 with second-degree criminal sexual conduct, a felony which carries a maximum sentence of 15 years in prison, and fourth-degree criminal sexual conduct, a misdemeanor which carries a maximum sentence of 2 years, in alleged incidents involving two Farmington Hills, Michigan boys aged 13 and 15. He was being held on $1 million bond in the Oakland County Jail and has been indefinitely suspended from his job with the newspaper. Thompson, 55, who wrote his columns, which were humor-based because the newspaper itself discouraged him from doing any serious writing because it was pro wrestling he was writing about, and did his hotline reports under the pseudonym of M.L. Curley after Moe, Larry, and Curly of Three Stooges cartoon fame. He was arrested the previous night after officers who had him under surveillance pulled over his Dodge Viper sports car. After searching his apartment in Southfield, Michigan, police found hundreds of allegedly pornographic photographs and videotapes of teenage boys, including some photos of Thompson being beaten and tortured by the boys, according to wire service reports. Thompson admitted to police that he had physical contact with both boys but denied that the contact was sexual. Farmington Hills Police Chief William Dwyer said to the Oakland Press that Thompson had been involved for 35 years in the solicitation of young boys. He admits to it. He admits to at least 1,200 encounters with young boys. 2 trucks were needed to remove the material confiscated from Thompson's apartment, including an electronic organizer with 1,200 names. While media reports suggested those were names of young boys he had alleged encounters with, his Rolodex, which apparently was infamous among those who knew him in pro wrestling circles, also included names of numerous prominent people within the pro wrestling industry whose contacts with him would have been unrelated to any activity of this type. Thompson was well known as being reasonably well connected, and even was responsible for landing one current employee a job with World Championship Wrestling, which ended up being reported by the NBC affiliate in Detroit. Over the years, he had numerous letters published in this and at least a couple of other pro wrestling publications, as well as on occasion corresponding news items. At his apartment, police confiscated nearly 1,000 videotapes, audio tapes, and photos of sexual encounters, as well as handcuffs and hockey masks, with dates, names, and phone numbers on many of the photographs. Media reports suggested he used his nice car and offers of money to entice young boys to get acquainted. Was Eyes TV in Detroit on February 26, which ran this as its lead story, interviewed a woman who they never identified, claiming she attempted to turn Thompson into the police more than a decade ago because of his contact with 5 boys she knew that Thompson would drive around, and she complained that the police didn't do anything about it. The story also alleged Thompson paid young boys to torture him. The investigation began when the 2 youths went to the police with statements concerning alleged activities in June. He was accused of using his 1998 red Dodge Viper, worth $70,000, to lure young men and boys and then sexually assault them. He's been a suspect in the solicitation of young boys since the mid-1970s, Dwyer said. The police chief said it would take 2 weeks to sift through all the material seized from his apartment. The Detroit News reported in the story on his arrest that Thompson's adopted father, David Weinman, who passed away in 1995, was a social work professor at Wayne State University, who co-wrote 2 books about troubled youth, Children Who Hate and Controls from Within. The newspaper announced it had fired Thompson a few days after the story broke. Apparently rumors about Thompson had been spread for years around Michigan wrestling circles. Thompson, according to reports, a car lover who always had a nice car, was known for driving around for hours in his car all over Michigan. Inside his car were at least 1 photo camera and a voice-activated tape recorder, which he didn't hide. He got many kids' phone numbers and programmed them into his pocketbook Rolodex. He traveled with stacks of tapes and photos, many of which are believed to have been pro wrestling tapes in addition to possibly porn, held together by a rubber band. There were people around the Michigan independent scene who noted Thompson used to always attend shows with young boys, usually a different one every time, but others who knew him were shocked by the charges. Dan Henderson, a member of the 1992 and 1996 U.S. Olympic Greco-Roman wrestling team at 181 pounds, was the surprise winner of the Rings King of Kings tournament and the $223,000 first prize on February 26 at Tokyo Budokan Hall. Henderson was the lone survivor in the most grueling and competitive MMA tournament in history, which started with 2 16-man tournaments on October 28 and December 22 and finished with the final 8 competing before a near-sellout crowd of 13,000 fans in the biggest complete shoot tournament in modern pro wrestling history. In news that was equally big, perhaps bigger, Ring's gamble of allowing its pro wrestling world heavyweight champion, Kiyoshi Tamura, into the tournament paid off big, as he made it into the Final 4 before losing a close decision. In the biggest match on the show, Tamura, coming out in this match to the traditional theme song of the old UWF promotion that he started with 10 years ago, scored a judge's decision over HENDO GRACIE in a mild upset in the first round. Thus the storyline from the beginning was made clear as UWF Pro Wrestling versus the GRACIE myth. Between that win and a draw earlier in the year with Frank Shamrock, Tamura did establish himself as a legitimate top-flight fighter, at least within his own rules, which is quite a distinction considering he doubles as well as being arguably the best technical pro wrestler in modern times. GRACIE, who is considered among fighting insiders as the legitimately best fighter in the family, had scored 2 submission wins in less than 90 seconds in his first tournament over Wataru Sakata and Maurice Smith, and some were tabbing him as the tournament favorite. Henderson, who is still an active world-class wrestler and hopeful of making a third Olympic team for Sydney in 2000, used his superior conditioning combined with at least one very controversial judge's decision in a tournament where literally any of the 8, had this same show been held in a few weeks, could have come out ahead, since 7 of the 8 matches ended in judges' decisions and the one that didn't was an overtime match. Henderson, who had former UFC heavyweight champion Randy Couture in his corner, weighed 198 for the tournament. He bested 3 men via decision, all of whom held weight advantages on him. In his first match, he scored numerous second-round takedowns to win the most lopsided unanimous decision on the show by scores of 19-16, 20-17 and 20-15. The fight was said to have been closer than the scores indicate because Yvel, a strong kickboxer, lost points for early fouls. In the second round, Henderson defeated Antonio Nogueira, who had a 33-pound weight advantage on him, via a very controversial decision that the crowd booed. Nogueira was able to use his size to score several takedowns on the world-class wrestler. After the match was sent into overtime after being ruled a draw after 2 rounds, it is said Nogueira clearly should have deserved the third round. In the judges' criteria for the show, it was stated that a weight difference of more than 10 kilograms, 22 pounds, should be taken into consideration when rendering a decision, but wasn't made clear how much that should be emphasized when rendering the decision. The belief is the judges gave Henderson the decision based on being close enough while giving away so much weight, and that may have played a part in the Renato Babalu final, although nobody booed that decision. This led to questions why it wasn't more of a factor in Tamura versus Babalu. In the finals, Henderson squeaked by Babalu, who held a 39-pound weight advantage on him, winning a match that would have been called a majority draw under most judging rules, since scores were 20-20, 20-20 and 20-19. Henderson was the only one making a big payoff for doing 5 matches over the lengthy tournament, as Babalu only received in the neighborhood of $20,000 for second place. Henderson has never lost in MMA competition, including winning a couple of close decisions en route to winning the toughest middleweight tournament in UFC history, and also winning a tournament in Brazil. He did lose a pure submission match via ankle lock to Frank Shamrock a few years ago. Tamura versus GRACIE was the match that drew the house, and although it was close, there have been no reports indicating Tamura didn't deserve the win. Reports are that GRACIE clearly won the first round, but Tamura got stronger due to better stamina and won the second and third rounds, including a dramatic moment late in the fight where the crowd sensed Tamura was going to make GRACIE tap with a Yoshiaki Fujiwara-style reverse crucifix armbar, although GRACIE escaped. After the match, GRACIE told reporters that he didn't consider it as a loss because it wasn't under Vale Tudo rules. This tournament was under rules similar to Vale Tudo, but not allowing any striking on the ground and other minor modifications of rules, and wanted a match with Tamura under those rules. GRACIE, who had a 17-pound weight disadvantage against Tamura, had never lost previously in MMA competition. Tamura largely saved the day for the Rings promotion, that from its start in 1991 had tried to claim it had the best real fighters in the world while presenting what was from the start mainly pro wrestling matches except for occasional shoots in prelims. The percentage of shoots grew as the fighters there from the start were replaced by more skilled younger fighters. The previous tournaments, while exposing a former Rings world champion in bits days Terriel, who couldn't handle Yvel at all, still wound up with Kopylov looking like the real deal, Yvel also looking to be a favorite, while Mikhail and Tamura also got out of their bracketing. But the Rings regulars ended up losing 5 of 7 matches to the outsiders on this show, but luckily for the promotion their fighter at least prevailed in the match that will be remembered the most on the show. Babalu had used his 44-pound weight advantage to squeak by Tamura 20-19, 19-19 and 20-20 in the semifinal after Tamura had beaten GRACIE. The general feeling was that Tamura was physically and emotionally spent, concentrating all his efforts on winning his high-profile early round match. There were also reports saying that although Babalu did deserve a close decision with all things being equal, throwing the weight criteria and could have given a win to Tamura. We'll have a complete report on the show in a week or 2 after viewing the videotape of the 4-hour live broadcast on WowWow. The tournament overall was considered a huge success. Rings had fallen in popularity in recent years. Its percentage of legitimate matches had grown over the past year, which is either good or bad depending upon your perspective. The retirement of its drawing card, Akira Maeda, and the inability to turn its younger stars who were both great pro wrestlers and real fighters, Tamura and Tsuyoshi Kosaka, into drawing cards saw its fortunes drop. Its future was in question due to WowWow cutting back its television money and, with the exception of Maeda's final match with Alexander Karelin in February, which was the biggest match in company history, attendance was down all year until this show. Complete results. 1. Babalu, 237, Brazil, defeated Ilyakine Mikhail, 204 Russia, with an armbar in 40 seconds of the first overtime, 10:40. Babalu received a penalty point in the first round for throwing Mikhail out of the ring, or he probably would have won the decision after regulation. 2. Henderson, 198 United States, defeated Gilbert Yvel, 222 Netherlands, via one-sided decision. Said to have been a great match. Henderson was able to dominate on the mat, and Henderson was much improved stand-up-wise. 3. Nogueira, 231 Brazil, defeated Andrei Kopylov, 264 Russia, via decision by scores of 20-19, 20-19 and 20-20. Reports are the first round was competitive, matching Brazilian jiu-jitsu and samba skills, and was an even round. But after 5 minutes, Kopylov, who scored 2 submission wins in his previous tournament both under 16 seconds, ran out of gas, and he clearly won that round. 4. Tamura, 193 Japan, defeated GRACIE, 176 Brazil, via a unanimous decision. 5. In a non-tournament match, Bobby Hoffman shocked Graham Zaza with a 34 seconds knockout from a right punch to the head. Hoffman is the Extreme Challenge heavyweight champion, while Zaza is a longtime rings regular. 6. Henderson in his semifinal beat Nogueira via decision. 7. Babalu beat Tamura via decision. Babalu also had a lot longer between his fights to rest than Tamura, but just had too much size. 8. Chris Haseman defeated Brad Kohler via armbar in 111 in a non-tournament battle of a rings pro wrestler from Australia who is strong and shoot against an American indie pro wrestler who has a lot of charisma and was a national caliber amateur wrestler. I believe Road Warrior Animal did not come in Kohler's corner this time out as had been billed. 9. Henderson beat Babalu in what most reports had being a close fight, as the judging indicated. WWF stock prices were expected to make a major turnaround this week, stemming from the announcement of a strong quarter and a Los Angeles Times story talking about CBS attempting to buy a $100 million equity stake in the company to garner the exclusive television rights. The story said that CBS would buy into the company, plus use its billboards, radio and TV stations to promote both the WWF as well as the XFL. USA has the right to match any offer to keep its exclusive cable contract with WWF, which expires in September for every show but Raw, but WWF does have an out even though the Raw contract itself doesn't expire until September 2001. But it's questionable whether USA Network would be able to compete with CBS, which would be expected to keep SmackDown on UPN and also use the XFL as Sunday afternoon programming during the spring on UPN, and move shows like Raw to TNN, which may be given a name change and a facelift. CBS could also push both products on MTV and Nickelodeon, which they would own if the Viacom and CBS mergers were approved. The story stated that all talks between News Corporation (FOX) and WWF for rights for a show on Fox and cable shows that would be moved to FX broke off because McMahon insisted on the XFL going along for the ride, and Fox has a commitment to NASCAR in the spring. Where this all gets interesting is that if WWF were to move, would USA Network attempt to fill some or all of the programming hours with another wrestling company, either one existing, ECW being the only real potential source, or by creating a new company, which would sure to be a major money loser for years. And there has been talk for years of Fox wanting its own programming, which several major WCW names just this past week were pitched with hypotheticals regarding being potential top players with. WWF also came out with its third quarter earnings report, covering the period from November through January, with the company earning $15.7 million profit with revenues of $98.4 million, up from $65.2 million in revenue the same time in 1998-99, and $10.2 million in profit. WWF stock on February 29 closed at $13 per share, up more than a full point and its highest close since the announcement of the XFL, but it was expected to open at $15.25 the next day due to sizable interest in the product in after-hours trading, due to the two news stories, with CBS stock increasing $6 in after-hours trading alone. 61 stars. I think one thing is abundantly clear. Vince McMahon will never allow another independent film producer into the world of the WWF. Like Wrestling with Shadows, the first independent movie McMahon allowed inside the walls of the WWF, which also wound up in court, a suit by Turner against McMahon that was eventually thrown out. It appears Beyond the Mat and Universal Studios are headed in the same direction. On February 28, McMahon ordered both UPN and USA Network to pull all advertising for the movie, which had purchased a heavy advertising campaign starting that night for its March 17 national opening. McMahon's philosophy was believed to have been that nothing would be done by the WWF to promote the movie, has now gone much farther than that, with rumblings of Universal threatening a restraint of trade lawsuit against WWFE for pulling the ads at the last minute. Movie ads had begun airing on ECW broadcasts 3 nights earlier. No ads appeared on Nitro on February 28. Upon viewing it, we decided that we had no emotional attachment to the film, said Jim Byrne, a WWF senior vice president. In regards to their advertising in the body of the show, it has been a long-standing policy of the WWF to now allow any advertising of a competitive wrestling product on our television because it could cause confusion in the marketplace. Producer Barry Blaustein also said that after Mick Foley, who stars in the movie, did an appearance plugging the movie on Good Morning America a few weeks ago, McMahon called Blaustein and said that if he was the friend of Foley's that he claimed to be, that he should never let him, even if he wanted to do any publicity for the movie, claiming he'd ruin the career of any wrestler who had anything positive to say about the film. Burns said he was unaware that Foley, or any wrestler, had ever been spoken with about doing publicity work or even saying anything positive regarding the movie. However, Foley has done media appearances where the interviewers have been told they cannot bring up the subject of the movie. Both movies were produced when McMahon was behind in the ratings game to World Championship Wrestling. WCW, since the company was ahead at the time and was planning its own movie project, Ready to Rumble, refused to give Blaustein the rights to edit the footage of their product without their input, and thus there is no WCW footage or even mention of the company in the movie. McMahon, before the current boom period for his company, signed deals with the respective filmmakers, Paul J. and Blaustein, giving them almost unlimited access. There were certain things such as not filming Undertaker out of character or Kane without his mask, and for J., not filming Steve Austin out of character, although Blaustein did have a few-second clip of Austin out of character in his movie that were agreed upon, but McMahon had no creative control of the final products. Because the Shadows movie covered Bret Hart and was there to document Montreal, at first, WWF was totally uncooperative after Hart left. While they never publicized the movie, and struck a deal for footage only if the producers agreed never to sell rights to the television version of the movie to any Turner-owned companies, WWF at one point was actually in conversation as far as buying the home video rights to the movie because, as it turned out, the negative McMahon portrayal fit into the storyline the company created in the wake of the famous match, or, perhaps, because by purchasing the home video rights, they could bury the movie forever in that market if they so chose to. Ironically, both movies ended up being critically acclaimed as Wrestling with Shadows won a Gemini Award, Canada's version of the Emmys, and Beyond the Mat was nominated as Best Documentary of the Year by the Directors Guild Association and made the final 12 in nominations for an Academy Award. The other irony is McMahon going to the lengths of banning advertising for the movie on his shows may only serve to create more publicity for the movie in the long run, which would result, very likely, in a lot of questioning of what exactly McMahon is afraid of. It is believed McMahon's unhappiness with the movie stems from the scenes of Mick Foley's children crying hysterically at the finish of the Royal Rumble match from 1999, since the company markets so heavily to children. At one point, WWF officials attempted to portray to ABC's 2020 that the footage was staged by Blaustein. The company has long stated in defense of charges that pro wrestling wasn't appropriate for children based on the content that children know the difference between the supposed fake Wile E. Coyote violence in pro wrestling and real violence, and the reaction of the children of one of their biggest stars was a strong contradiction. Not to mention the movie's theme is that the fake violence isn't nearly as fake as most people think. The Ryan Gracie situation has turned into major news in Brazil, including repercussions from a media standpoint on the entire sport of jiu-jitsu. Gracie, charged with stabbing Marcos Vinicius de Rosa in a nightclub brawl on February 13, was a fugitive after an order by Judge João Guilherme Chaves Jr. for preventative arrest and incarceration. After the ruling, the police couldn't find Gracie at the address he gave them, nor could he be found in Sao Paulo, where he has an academy. Gracie, if convicted, would be facing a maximum 4 years in prison. His uncle, Carlos Gracie Jr., protested the decision, saying that jail would only make his nephew worse. His lawyer claimed Gracie would present himself to the police on February 29. The Brazilian press has covered this strongly, and there was a meeting between politicians in Rio de Janeiro on whether to remove all government sponsorship of the sport. For February 28, Raw nearly tripled Nitro head-to-head for the first time, ending with a 6.50 rating, 6.52 first hour, 6.48 seconds hour, and 9.9 share, while Nitro ended with a new record low over the past few years mark of a 2.57 rating, 3.00 first hour, 2.19 seconds hour, and 3.7 share. Raw started strong probably due to pay-per-view curiosity and actually drew a higher rating opposed than unopposed. The main event of Rock vs. Triple H and Show did a 7.24 rating. Nitro's main event of Vicious vs. Abbott did a 2.75. The combined viewing audience was 9.5 million. Head-to-head figures saw Raw at 6.66, opening monologue with Triple H, Show and Rock, to 1.90. Jarrett vs. Vampiro, Raw at 6.70, monologue continues. Hardys vs. Acolytes, to 1.89. Artist vs. David Flair, Raw at 6.29. Angle vs. Rikishi to 2.18. Miller vs. Maestro, Ric Flair vs. Hennig, and Raw at 6.33. Edge and Christian vs. Snow and Blackman, Rock vs. Brawler, to Nitro's 2.15. Luger vs. Bagwell. For February 21st, the combined audience of 9.2 million represented the lowest total in a couple of years, showing that the decline of WCW is taking its toll on casual fan interest in the industry as a whole. Raw ended up doing a 5.88 rating, 5.63 first hour, 6.10 seconds hour, with an 8.9 share. Nitro did a 2.74 rating, 3.17 first hour, 2.33 seconds hour, and a 4.0 share. Raw peaked at a 7.05 for the Show and Triple H and X-Pac vs. Rock and Cactus Jack and Kane final 6 minutes. The actual final quarter, which included the first 4 minutes of the main event plus Taz vs. Bossman, drew a 6.25 rating. The Nitro main event of Hogan vs. Luger in a cage drew a 2.64 rating, although it did peak with a 3.76 for the post-match double team segment. The 4 head-to-head segments saw Raw at 5.65, opening interview segment with DX, Rock, Cactus, Kane and Show to 2.27, Harris Twins vs. Funk and Rhodes, Raw at 5.83, Chyna and Jericho vs. Bulldog and Angle, to 1.97, Sid and Flair interview, Bagwell vs. Maestro, Raw at 5.48, Too Cool vs. Snow and Blackman, Malenko and Saturn vs. Godfather and Brown, to 2.06, Bigelow vs. Wall, and Raw at 5.38, Edge and Christian and Hardys vs. Outlaws and Dudleys, to 2.64, Hogan vs. Luger. SmackDown on February 24th did a 4.93 rating and 7.0 share. Thunder on February 23rd did its lowest unopposed number ever with a 2.03 rating and 3.1 share, getting blasted by the high ratings of both the Grammys and Millionaire. The show's low point was actually the Sid vs. Luger main event at 1.81 and the high point was Flair vs. Vampiro at 2.26. Weekend ratings for February 26th to 27th saw Livewire at 1.7, Superstars at 1.7 and Sunday Night Heat at 3.23. WCW Saturday Night actually did its all-time record low of its 20-plus year history since WTCG became a superstation, and as a local franchise dating back nearly 30 years, with a 1.26 rating and being seen for the first time since the infancy of cable in less than 1 million homes. 993,000. Weekend ratings for February 19th to 20th saw Livewire at 1.4, unusually low, Superstars at 1.6 and Sunday Night Heat at 3.50. We don't have full details on the February 25th ECW show other than it did a 1.05 rating but peaked at 1.4 for the Impact Players vs. Raven and Dreamer match. ECW on February 18th did a 1.21 rating and 2.0 share with the audience building the entire show. The Awesome vs. Tanaka main event did a 1.42 rating, making it the second most watched ECW match in history, behind only the Tao vs. Crazy match and Awesome/Van Dam/Sabu Angle a few weeks ago at 1.47. A more pleasant surprise is Crazy vs. C.W. Anderson doing a 1.29. Roller Jam was also up to in 0.75. Mexico. Pero Aguayo returned to Arena Mexico after more than 7 years to shoot the angle to lead to the final match of his career on March 10th in the same building. Aguayo, now 54, had, due to his status as one of the 10 biggest wrestling legends in the history of the country, even though he worked since 1992 with rival AAA, had such status that he asked for and was able to get his final career match at Arena Mexico, considered the cathedral and most prestigious pro wrestling arena in the country. Aguayo, who after a farewell tour that drew huge crowds in every major city in the country over the past year plus for AAA, showed up at ringside on the February 25th show and was attacked by more than a dozen heel wrestlers after running in and making a save, bloodied up huge and left laying, going out on a stretcher. Since he's headed to Japan this week, he won't be back until the retirement match. With so many different heels attacking him, none of whom were Fishman. It had long been believed that Aguayo's final opponent would be Fishman, a huge rival of Aguayo's in the 70s and 80s, who would lose and remove his mask since his career is headed to a close as well. The February 25th show drew 8,900 fans, which was reported in local press as a huge disappointment, with March 10th being the Aguayo farewell and a high-profile Pierroth Jr. vs. Mascara Ano 2000 hair vs. hair match, and March 17th being the Atlantis vs. Villano Tercero mask vs. mask match, which has been built up for more than a year. Nothing until that point is going to make people jump at buying tickets. The main event saw Tarzan Boy beat El Satanico in a hair vs. hair match. The third fall saw Tarzan both miss a tope, crashing on the floor, and a plancha, both planned spots, both times teasing count-out losses but crawling in. After the second miss, Satanico paraded around like he had the match in hand, and Tarzan Boy snuck in and cradled him from behind. The only comment in Ovaciones about the quality of the match was a comment that could be taken either way, basically saying, in regards to Tarzan Boy, in this match, I want to confirm that in wrestling it is not only the excellent physique, nor the pretty face, but also that it is necessary to have a good repertoire of holds and counter holds. The reports we heard were that the match was good but not great. Tarzan Boy has charisma but is still green. Satanico is on his last legs. Mil Mascara's Aaron Rodriguez is talking about running for senator of San Luis Potosi, which is his home state. If he wins, he won't become the first pro wrestling star to be elected to national public office, but I'd bet he'll become the first masked senator in history. Damien and Halloween, Cyclope in WCW, are headed to EMLL next month to work at Arena Mexico. Ringo Mendoza retained the CMLL middleweight title, beating Blue Panther on February 27 at Arena Coliseo in Mexico City in what was described as an old-style mat classic that Panther can carry better than almost anyone. AAA's Rey de Reyes, King of Kings, show from March 5 at El Toreo in Naucalpan, which will be the biggest show so far this year, is headlined by the King of Kings tournament with Dos Caras, Killer, AAA Psicosis, Abismo Negro Jr., El Alebrije, Oscar Sevilla, Electroshock, Maniaco, Mascara Sagrada Jr., Pathfinder, Charlie Manson, AAA Hysteria, Cibernetico, El Mexicano, Espectro Jr., and Blue Demon Jr. Also La Parca Jr. vs. El Hijo del Espectro in a mask vs. mask, Oriental, with Rossi Moreno vs. Pentagon, with Xochitl Hamada, in which the loser's girlfriend gets shaved bald. Sangre Chicana and Shockmate and El Texano and Cobarde 2 vs. Heavy Metal and Octagon, Hector Garza and AAA Mascara Sagrada, and opening with the minis. AAA did its Reina de Reinas, Queen of Queens tournament on February 20 in Morelia with Rossi Moreno beating Xochitl Hamada to win the 16-woman tournament. El Hijo del Santo and El Hijo del Diablo will be taping the largest Spanish-language show in the world, Sábado Gigante, on March 1 in Miami, for a March 4 air date. It's expected the two will shoot an angle and build to a hair match in a northern city where Diablo Jr. is a bigger name. All Japan. Kenta Kobashi pinned Vader to win the Triple Crown on February 27 at Budokan Hall before the usual sellout crowd of 16,300. Kobashi went into the ring with taped-up ribs, and Vader attacked the ribs for most of the match. It was said to have been an outstanding match, with lots of near falls ending when Kobashi hit a desperation lariat for the pin in 1949. Both collapsed on the mat from exhaustion at the finish. Jun Akiyama was at ringside for the finish. Vader and Kobashi shook hands and Vader raised Kobashi's hand after the match. After the match, Kobashi said he would defend the title next against Akiyama, which would be in early June. On February 28, Kobashi predicted that he and Akiyama would be the two finalists in the Champion Carnival on April 15, and said if that was the case, the Carnival final match would also be their Triple Crown bout, which would be the first time in history that has happened. Just as big was the semi-main where Akiyama pinned Mitsuharu Misawa in 23:40 with a reverse exploder suplex. I believe this was the first time Akiyama has ever pinned Misawa. As you can see from the booking, with Misawa already established strong, Misawa gave the major push to Kobashi and particularly Akiyama, which seems to be gearing up for a potential split. One way or another, the future of this company will be decided by the end of March. Akiyama and Kobashi are now officially broken up. As a tag team, Akiyama will become the leader of his own group, or go on his own. The other big match at the Budokan show was Stan Hansen and Akira Taue and Toshiaki Kawada over Steve Williams and Giant Kimala 2 and Johnny Smith when Hansen pinned Kimala 2 with a lariat in 16:30. The annual Champion Carnival tournament will be from March 24 to April 15, which is the next tour. The planned entrants are Misawa, Vader, Kawada, Williams, Howe, Johnny Ace, Kobashi, Mike Barton, Akiyama, Johnny Smith, Tomlin Honda, Wolf Hockfield, Masao Inoue, Takawa Mori, Jun Izumida, and Yoshihiro Takayama. The finals are at Budokan Hall, as is tradition. The major cities on the tour are March 24th and March 25th at Korakuen Hall, March 26th at Nagoya Aichi Gym, March 30th in Osaka, March 31st in Hiroshima, April 8th at Korakuen Hall, April 9th in Sendai, and April 11th in Kanazawa. Announced as a major change is that all matches will be one fall to the finish, so they've eliminated the time limit draw finish from the possibilities, which guarantees all clean wins. The actual lineups for the various nights should be announced this week. February 25th in Yokosuka, Misawa actually worked the opening match in a tag team with regular partner Yoshinari Ogawa to beat Yoshinobu Kanemaru and Kentaro Shiga because due to his injury, he has no business being out there. Also on that show, Honda and Inoue retained the All-Asian Tag Team titles, beating Giant Kimala 2 and Smith in 29:40 when Honda pinned Kimala with a throw-out German suplex. Regarding the potential split of this company into two groups, apparently there were talks as far back as 1 year ago because Motoko Baba, the owner, and Misawa, the top star and leader of the wrestlers, couldn't get along. The talk of this split was really strong backstage at the February 27th Budokan Hall show, but there was no clear answer as to exactly what was going to go down. Apparently Nippon TV at that time, which was shortly after the death of Shohei Baba, told Misawa that they wouldn't, due to the timing of being after Baba's death, go against the company that Baba had formed and that had been on the network since its inception. The feeling now is that several directors of NTV, now that the Baba death is more than 1 year old, would side with Misawa in the split. Kawada, and maybe Taue as well, along with the older wrestlers like Haruka Eigen, Masafuchi, Mitsuo Momota, etc., are expected to side with Mrs. Baba, while Kobashi, Akiyama and the rest of the younger wrestlers are siding with Misawa. They have a special fan appreciation show for March 11th at Korakuen Hall. Two newcomers will debut in a battle royal, former sumo wrestler Takeshi Inoue, 27, and 18-year-old Kenta Kobayashi, who has got to change his name. The top matches will be Ogawa vs. Shigeo Okamura, Akiyama vs. Shiga, Masao Inoue and Honda vs. Muhammad Yone and Daisuke Ikeda from Battlerts and Misawa, and Kobashi and Tsuyoshi Kikuchi vs. Masafuchi and Kawada and Taue. February 20th TV show did a 2.8 rating, and February 27th with the Vader Kobashi and Misawa Taue did a 4.9 rating. New Japan. The latest on the Rikidozan Memorial Show on March 11th at Yokohama Arena is that the still haven't announced Genichiro Tenryu's partner in the tag team main event against Naoya Ogawa and Shinya Hashimoto. They shot an angle at Narita Airport on February 23rd where both Ogawa and Hashimoto went to see Antonio Inoki off as he was flying back to Los Angeles, where he lives. Hashimoto slapped Ogawa in the face at the airport. Ogawa said he would do the match but asked for special stipulations, and that he wouldn't form a tag team with Hashimoto. He said he wanted Hashimoto to be in a different corner and they wouldn't tag in and out, but at every 5-minute call, one would replace the other automatically. The rumors as to the fourth person in this match of late have been either Manabu Nakanishi or UFO Big Van Vader. The original one, Sylvester Turkey, is under a developmental contract with the WWF and is in Louisville, so I'm not even sure who this would be, although the name Paul Berlins gets bandied about from time to time. J.J. Dillon called the office looking to get a hold of Keiji Muto. A decision will be made this week as to whether to move the May 5th Fukuoka show from the International Center Arena to the 80,000-seat Dome Stadium. New Japan has run several Fukuoka Dome shows, but has always struggled to draw more than 40,000. If they go the Dome route, they'll probably do an explosive barbed wire match with Riki Choshu versus Atsushi Onita. It was revealed that Kazuyuki Fujita underwent a throat operation on February 2nd, 2 days after his Tokyo Dome shoot match against Hansa Nyman. He wasn't able to start training for the May 1st DSE tournament until this week. New Japan has contacted people in the United States about signing up fighters for shoot matches, probably under the UFO banner for a show later in the year. They were in particular looking at getting unknown fighters from the Obike gym, offering $1,500 to $2,500 per fight. February 19th TV show did a 3.4 rating. Other Japan notes. There was a huge problem reminiscent of the famous fire incident in ECW that took place on the February 22nd Big Japan show at Korakuen Hall. The semifinal of the show was the finals of their Big Japan Grand Prix Extreme Tournament, with Shadow WX, real name Satoru Shiga, facing Mike Samples. WX basically set himself on fire. Oil was poured all over his body, so when fire was thrown at him as he came off the top rope to deliver a flying body press, he went up in a giant cloud of flames. This burned through his t-shirt and left his body, both arms and his face on fire for about 1 minute. He managed to roll around on the mat to smother out the fire and had to be legitimately taken to the hospital in an ambulance. Management of Korakuen Hall was furious and now have banned every promotion from using fire and fluorescent tubing, and both the local police and fire department are investigating the incident. Korakuen Hall is expected to announce some sort of sanctions against the Big Japan promotion because of this incident. Shinya Kojiga later in the week said that he'd been assured his group would still be allowed to run shows at Korakuen Hall. Shiga, who came up with the idea for the stunt, was, because it went so wrong, suspended for 1 month and given a salary cut. Kyoko Inoue became the first woman to win a men's championship in Japanese wrestling on February 25 at Korakuen Hall, winning the WU Tag Team titles with Koto Fuyuki for the FMW promotion, beating H and Mr. Ganasuke. The Finnish saw rookie Chocoball Mukai join ECW Japan by giving a fisherman buster to Ganasuke, allowing Fuyuki to use his Samson Crunch for the pin. After the match, Fuyuki announced he would challenge Tetsuhiro Kuroda for the WU heavyweight title on March 27 at Korakuen Hall. Also on that show, Kuroda retained the WU heavyweight title, beating Willie Takayama and Koji Nakagawa, and Geto became the top contenders for the new tag champs, winning a 4 corners match over Hisakatsu Oya and Naohiko Yamazaki, Hideki Hasaka and Yoshinori Sasaki, and Kentaro Kanimura and Jado. The former Gasaku Goshigawara, when he was a male wrestler, apparently after getting a sex change operation in Thailand, debuted as female wrestler Azusa Kudo, winning a handicap match over Kaori Nakayama and Emi Motokawa. Balls Mahoney also won a 3-way dance over Lance Cade and Crazy Boy when he used the Nutcracker Suite on a table on Cade. There have been merger talks in Japan between its DirecTV, not affiliated with the company of the same name in the US, and Sky Perfect TV. This will affect wrestling if there is a merger, but we're not exactly sure how. Unlike in the US, the pay-per-view events are carried by all carriers, except UFC, which is a different deal. In Japan, with no cable and satellites still in their infancy, the companies buy rights to televise pro wrestling, the MMA major shows, as a way to get wrestling and sports fans to buy their company dishes, so promotions are exclusive with one or the other company, which ups the going rate. Currently, Sky Perfect TV, which carries soccer and DSE along with WCW and ECW, is available in 1.66 million homes, while DirecTV, which carries FMW version and UFC, is in 440,000 homes. The feeling is that a merger would remove the bidding war and hurt the marginal promotions. There were strong rumors that Naoki Sano will get the one remaining spot in the April Super J Cup besides the upcoming Battlerts and Big Japan tournament winners. Before going into work shoot and eventually total shoot matches, which he did poorly in, Sano worked for New Japan and was Jushin Liger's biggest rival about 10 years ago. With the success of the February 26th Budokan show and Wow Wow going to back Ring Stronger and it appearing to turn into a total shoot promotion this year, Liger Maeda after the show flew to Los Angeles and met with Hicks and Gracie. A new promotion called JPWA, Japan Pro Wrestling Association, announced its debut show on April 14 at Korakuen Hall with a Team USA vs Team Japan series of matches. The Japanese team will be managed by Yoshiaki Fujiwara, and the American team by Nick Bockwinkel. All Japan Women will be holding a one-night tournament for the All Japan Championship on March 1 at Hakata Star Lanes with Miyuki Fuji, Keo Nomi, Nani Takahashi, and Miho Wakezawa. Big Japan announced it was working with the New Jersey-based Combat Zone Wrestling, and John Danzig would be coming in March, and Big Japan would sell CZW videos. Big Japan is also promoting an international extreme death match tournament in April. Atsushi Onita ran a show at the high school that he graduated from, Surgadai High, in Tokyo on February 27, drawing 2,550 fans for his typical Onita show barbed wire main event, plus a first time ever in major Japanese wrestling where Onita teamed with his 50-year-old high school teacher Kazuo Fujie to wrestle against his 19-year-old classmate Taichi Suzuki and 21-year-old pro wrestler Viking Yuichi Taniguchi. Suzuki turned on Taniguchi, so Onita pinned him. Mil Mascaras was mad at Gong magazine for quoting him in an interview saying that he was going to retire from wrestling this year. Mascaras claims he never said he was going to retire. In Japan, they are billing his August tour for CMLL Japan as his Japanese retirement tour. They are going to build that tour against a brother feud for the Mascaras brothers, Mil Mascaras and Dos Caras, and older brother El Psicodelico, who is something like 63 years old and wasn't even good in his prime, against Los Hermanos Dinamita, Cien Caras and Mascara Anno 2000 and Universo 2000. which should make for some terrible Japanese-style matches. Ultimo Guerrero, Rey Bucanero and Ricky Marvin are also on the tour. Marvin made a big hit on the last tour as an undercard flyer here and there. Liz Chase, who has wrestled since the late 70s and was still active in South Florida Independence, reportedly passed away while having cosmetic surgery done in Costa Rica. No other details were available at press time. Beyond the Mat was nominated for Best Documentary of 1999 by the Directors Guild of America and also received an award as one of the best movies screened at Cinequest 10, the annual San Jose Film Festival. The highlight of the February 23 Memphis Championship Wrestling TV tapings in Tunica, Mississippi was the appearance of Road Dogg. Road Dogg did a pull-apart brawl with Jerry Lawler stemming from the feud they've built up on TV where Hunter Hearst Helmsley was sending people to the area to get Lawler. They had a match which ended when the Caw guys, in particular Bull Payne and Todd Morton managed by Alcoholic, and yes, he does a drunk routine, attacked Lawler and Dogg saved him. This led to a tag match on the second hour of tapings with Lawler and Road Dogg beating Morton and Payne via count out. Barry Blaustein appeared on February 26 on both the Memphis Championship Wrestling and Power Pro Wrestling shows to promote the movie, which opens in Memphis on March 3, 2 weeks prior to its national open. He is also scheduled for the full hour on Larry King Live on March 15. Blaustein aired on tape on Lawler's show but live on Hale's show. On the Lawler/Road Dogg angle, Lawler has tried to explain, and while he talks great, even this angle is a stretch, that he puts over the heels on Monday and Tuesday nights because he has to counter the boring commentary of Jim Ross and Michael Cole, but that the King in Memphis is a different person, who takes care of business in the ring. Blue Meanie did an interview claiming he's the new Bret, as Jim Neidhart's tag partner in the New Hart Foundation. Neidhart told Meanie that on the TV he'd be teaming with Curtis Hughes, not Meanie. They're grooming Neidhart and Meanie for the tag titles. On PPW, they dedicated the show to the memory of Bonnie Coffey, the wife of longtime behind-the-scenes Memphis fixture Guy Coffey. Jimmy Valiant was on the show. They did a gimmick where Lance Jade did a voice impersonation of Alan Steele, asking for a match with Moondog spots, so that match was made. Randy Hales said the elders from his church were about to kick him out because C.B. Wyatt last week claimed Hales was his father. Hales denied it. Wyatt said that next week he'd bring his mother to TV to tell the truth. Tracy Smothers is doing the Rob Van Dam kicking a chair into the face move, calling it the Van Smotherator. Sir Mo did a run-in as a heel at the end of the show attacking Derek King. Lance Russell at this point is going to be a regular announcer for MCW with David Jett. There were problems with the trans at the tapings on February 23 and Russell didn't make it in time for the first show taped. He'll appear on the second show. Kevin Kelly, who was in to look at the talent from the WWF, since he was there, took his place. The first week the two shows went head-to-head at 11 a.m. on Saturdays, which was January 22. Power Pro did a 5.0 and MCW did a 3.6. On February 19, the shows both did 3.6s, while on February 26, PPW did a 2.94 and MCW did a 2.74. Wrestling historians Fred Hornby and Scott Teal have just finished a book on wrestling in Madison Square Garden, which includes results of every show from 1880 through 1999. I haven't seen it yet, but it's available for $29 from Wrestling Then and Now, P.O. Box 2781, Andersonville, Tennessee 37077. The Ring's promotion claims it will be running shows in June in Honolulu, in July in Illinois and in August in Salt Lake City, and is also talking about expanding into Brazil. Rena Mero got horrible reviews for her performance on the show Relic Hunter. She will be on the cover of the May issue of Muscle and Fitness Solo. After all, she is the world's fittest woman. She's also scheduled for Cigar Magazine and National Enquirer TV. Indie manager and promoter Norm Connors, who worked as Notorious Norm for Steel City Wrestling, won $32,000 on February 22's episode of Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. On the show he mentioned working with Public Enemy and George Steele to Regis Philbin. Shane Douglas appeared unannounced on the February 26 XPW show in Hollywood, California and did a 15-minute promo on WCW, in particular on Bill Bush, Hulk Hogan, and Ric Flair. Douglas did a Sam Kinison routine where he pretended to call Bush up on his cell phone, including yelling out Bush's phone number to the live crowd on the mic. Douglas reformed his triple threat group from ECW with Chris Condito and Tammy Sitch, who appeared on the show. Douglas asked how WCW could draw ratings with chunks of fossilized manure like Hogan and Flair. Earlier in the show, Condito, dressed up to look like Terry Funk and doing many fun spots, won the group's title from Damian Steele. They also had a King of the Deathmatch tournament won by local wrestler Supreme, who beat former ECW wrestler John Kronus in the main event, which was a no-rope barbed wire, thumbtacks, glass and nail match. Axel Rotten debuted losing in the semi-finals to Kronus. Reports are the show had too much blood and wasn't as good as their previous show. Another former ECW wrestler, Mustafa of the Gangstas, worked the undercard. The XPW website claims they'll start on KTLA, the WB affiliate, in Los Angeles on March 31st. MMA. K1 announced its April 23 Osaka Dome lineup headlined by Francisco Filio vs. Jerome LeBanner and Andy Hug vs. Greub Fitoza. They may add Peter Aerts vs. Ernesto Hoost as the main event, but it hasn't been announced yet. K1 held its first show in Melbourne, Australia on February 27 with an 8-man tournament won by Mark Hart, 25, a Samoan, who will debut in Japan at this year's Grand Prix tournament. The March 10 UFC pay-per-view show was thrown for a loop when the Raw team pulled its two fighters, Frank Trigg, who was facing Bob Cook in a match looked forward to by insiders, and Vladimir Matyushenko, who was facing Lance Gibson. While it means nothing for the marquee value of the show, it put Semaphore Entertainment Group in the position of having to find two fighters on just 2 weeks' notice, which is totally inadequate training time. The problems between the sides appear to be that the Raw team didn't like Semaphore Entertainment Group's 90-day exclusivity clause in the contract. Fighters couldn't fight for a rival organization 90 days after the match, and that they wanted video rights to their fighters' matches and wanted added money if their fighters were to appear in the upcoming UFC video game. Scott Adams, an unknown fighter with an 0-1 record, will replace the injured Tim Lasik against Travis Fulton at the March 10 UFC pay-per-view show. There is talk that Pat Miletic or Boss Rutten may announce their retirement from fighting at the show. Miletic, the UFC's lightweight champion, took a beating from Jose Pele Landi of Brazil in a non-UFC fight and has been plagued by a series of injuries over the past year. Rutten blew out his knee recently, and he's now 35. There had been rumblings about him not wanting to fight any longer for some time, hoping to make it as an actor. Royce Gracie did a recent interview, and when asked about potentially fighting Ken Shamrock, now that both are with the same promotion, he said he would never fight Shamrock until Shamrock wins a 16-man tournament. You can read between the lines what that really means, since Shamrock few such tournaments exist and Shamrock will almost surely never enter one at this stage of his career. He did praise Frank Shamrock, saying he felt he was the best under 200-pound fighter around. Pancrase ran February 27 in Osaka before a sellout 800. With the exception of Ikuizumi Noa using a choke on rookie Masibu Ichi in 121, every match went the time limit. Main event saw Sanae Kikuta win a 15 minutes decision over Ryushi Yanagisawa. ECW. Sabu worked the house shows over the weekend, having a bad match with Whipwreck the first night and working with Scott D'Amore at the TV taping. He was said to have gotten a disappointing reaction both nights. He had a long talk with Paul Heyman in Cincinnati, and right now it doesn't seem anyone is clear how this is going to transpire. Sabu is telling friends that he won't work the pay-per-view unless he gets his back pay for previous pay-per-view shows. Heyman has claimed Sabu isn't owed any money to begin with, that Sabu was sent a letter saying if he didn't work in Ohio he'd be in breach of contract, and Sabu was threatened with a lawsuit. Heyman said Sabu did play a game and had some legal threats, but said he hasn't filed anything and he considers it a bluff. At this point, Sabu doesn't appear to be part of the major plans for the pay-per-view show. Sabu's mother was hospitalized again right at press time from chest pains. Even though the pay-per-view is less than 2 weeks away, March 12 in Danbury, Connecticut, at press time, no official lineup has been released. At press time they had sold 1,996 tickets for $70,445 in a building set up for 4,000. The major angles to build the top matches will be shot on March 4 at the ECW Arena, which looks to be headlined by new tag champs Dreamer and Tanaka defending against Raven and Awesome Incredible, and Storm vs. Gedo and Jado from FMW. Jerry Lynn's ankle hasn't healed as quickly as they would have liked. He will be at the pay-per-view, but it's expected it'll be 6 to 9 weeks before he's back in the ring. Rob Van Dam got his cast off and will be at the March 4 TV tapings and the pay-per-view show. They have no set date for a return. He's talking about 9 weeks, but it may be as long as 12 weeks. Spike Dudley suffered a torn posterior collateral ligament and was hoping to get the surgery after the pay-per-view, but he's getting the surgery imminently and is off the pay-per-view, and will be out around 6 weeks after surgery. Tanaka doesn't appear to have a long tag title reign because he'll be leaving for several weeks after the pay-per-view. TNN taping for next week on February 26 in Cincinnati before 2,650, which was a full house in that every seat was taken. but they could have set up a lot more seats and not blocked off so much of the building. Reports are it was a really good show. Jim Molyneux came out and claimed the ECW Hardcore Revolution game was the best-selling video game in the country. Cyrus came out and said that Molyneux's face was a ratings killer. Cyrus bragged about the ratings of Rockin' Bowl and had a guy with him doing that ridiculous dance on the Rockin' Bowl TV commercial. Molyneux said he was going to do the extreme dance, and attacked the guy. Cyrus jumped Molyneux and left him laying, got the other guy up and had him do the dance again. During in Roadkill, who had Elektra this week, beating Guido and Sal E. Graziano. Tao beat Whipwreck, who appeared to have injured his shoulder landing poorly on a Frankensteiner, and he was in a sling later that night and will be out of action for a few weeks. Diamond offered an open challenge. Jazz came out. Cyrus came out and claimed the network was sick of intergender matches and they, like Molyneux's face, were a ratings disaster and said he was bringing out a more credible opponent, and Rhino came out. Jazz started to leave, but Cyrus told her she was the one facing Rhino, which went all of 15 seconds. Crazy beat C.W. Anderson. Nova and Chetty and Cash beat the Baldies when Nova pinned Tony DeVito. The Baldies jumped them after leading to a new Jack run-in. Grimes at one point used a pizza cutter on Jack. Sabu sold a lot for Scott D'Amore, largely because I guess he wanted D'Amore to make a good impression before beating him. Dupes announced that even though they lost a Loser Leaves Town match on TV, they weren't going anywhere. Sandman came out and caned them both. It was their last appearance as they said their goodbyes backstage. Awesome pinned Rhino after the power bomb through a table. Main event started as the Impact Players against Raven and Dreamer but ended with Dreamer and Tanaka as the new tag champs. It started with Dreamer apologizing to Francine about the DDT on TV, and he also apologized to Raven since he was after Raven for doing the same thing. Dreamer said he and Raven should patch things up and win the tag titles. Francine came out and turned on Dreamer, saying he DDT'd her on purpose and ripped him. Dreamer saying he was nothing until she started managing him. She slapped him. He did the pile driver with the panties showing spot until Raven made the save and hit Dreamer with a DDT. Raven and Francine left and once again they started double-teaming Dreamer. Tanaka came out and they brawled into the stands. Dreamer put Storm through a table with a Spicoli driver again and Tanaka pinned Credible to win the titles. There was a backstage incident on February 25th in Toledo, Ohio before about 1,700. Sandman was apparently belligerent backstage. With Heyman not there, Dreamer was running the show. Somehow Sandman bet Chetty, who was a very good amateur wrestler in high school, that if he could pin him in 30 or 60, as different people have different versions seconds, he'd give him $600. Chetty did pin him right at 30 seconds and then stretched him another 30 seconds after beating him. They never came to blows and Chetty gave Sandman back his money after and there didn't appear to be any hard feelings when it was over. Onlookers said it was obvious Chetty could have done whatever he wanted whenever he wanted. Actually, that was the most excitement on the show. The undercard was said to have been good but Raven and Corino reportedly had an awful match in the semi after a good undercard. Raven, by his own admission, sticks more to comedy on the non-TV tapings to avoid more physical damage. Sandman and Crazy beat Tao and Rhino on top coming off the TV angle attempting to elevate Crazy and Tao to a more prominent spot, but that was said to have been a weak main event. TNN show on February 25th opened with a Cyrus rant about ordering them to put the TV title on Rhino. The Cyrus gimmick as the liaison with the heel TV network against the Rebel promotion works great, but it would be better if the name of the character wasn't Cyrus, because that makes it a fake pro wrestling angle as opposed to a reality-based pro wrestling storyline. Within worked pro wrestling everyone has gimmick names, but in a reality-based angle, everyone knows no TNN executive walks around calling himself Cyrus. Paul Heyman came out and smashed Cyrus with the title belt. Rhino speared Heyman and they put the boots to him. Sandman's music played. Heyman mysteriously disappeared while Sandman stood in the crowd doing his entrance. Sandman beat Rhino in 5:17 via DQ when Tao Blue missed. Sandman looked terrible. He used a ladder in the cane and did a Frankensteiner off the top called a Heineken Rana, which was pretty clever. Rhino speared Sandman through a table after the match until Crazy made the save. During and Roadkill challenged the Dupes to a Loser Leaves Town match, which they won in 1:16 when during Pinjack. Crowd was real hot for it. Dreamer challenged Raven. Francine came out and yelled at Dreamer saying it was an accident what Raven did, told him he had a bad attitude and basically nagged the hell out of him. It should be noted that they showed the clip of her getting DDT'd by Raven a few weeks ago and she looks to have dropped noticeable weight even since then. They say the camera adds 10 pounds, so this is really disturbing. The Impact Players came out. Francine then challenged them to wrestle Raven and Dreamer, which Dreamer wasn't thrilled with. Raven came out in street clothes. Unless Raven drops considerable weight, he should never come on television wearing a tight shirt. He says he's 265 right now. Some in the company have estimated him as high as 280, and looks every bit of it, and by his own claim, is bulking up before cutting down, in his cycle, and I don't mean his cutting down cycle, hasn't kicked in yet. That's way too heavy for his frame to go on TV in tight-fitting clothes because it gives the appearance of being totally out of shape. Why in a promotion where the heels he faces are the size of Storm and credible that he'd need to be that weight is probably more that he's getting in the size mode because he thinks he needs it for WWF in August. The players took good bumps. Raven's wrestling now consists of doing a few trademark spots. Dreamer gave Storm a Spicoli driver off the middle rope through a table. James Vandenberg, who doesn't have a name here, gave Raven powder. He went to throw it at Storm, who ducked, and it instead hit Dreamer, who was about to piledrive Dawn Marie. Dreamer blinded and DDTs Francine. That was really scary because every time Francine gets DDT'd, she drops another 10 pounds and she's about to go into the minus poundages. Raven carried Francine to the back leaving Dreamer on his own, and he got spike spinning pile driven and was pinned by Credible in 8:56. The show ended with Vandenberg basically giving away that he's pulling the strings, maneuvering Raven and Dreamer against each other. People are praising Anderson and Grimes for their work, and Grimes in particular is getting noticed as someone who has good ECW-level charisma. They did backstage angles in Cincinnati for TNN, including Rhino spearing Crazy through a table and the Impact players jumping Tanaka. Chili Willie, a Carolinas indie who has worked here the past 2 weeks, has impressed people with his charisma. With the Arena Football League season canceled due to a labor dispute, the scheduled TNN TV dates that would preempt ECW in its regular time slot over the summer, there were only 2 dates, are also out the window. There is talk that TNN would instead broadcast games from AF2, which is a minor league of the Arena Football League, which usually plays on Thursdays, but they may use those games to fill the slots reserved for Arena Football, which includes the 2 dates. ECW debuts in mid-April in both Kansas City at Memorial Hall and in St. Louis at an as-of-yet unnamed site, and is planning an early May debut in Minneapolis, although the latter date announcement may have been premature. Christian York and Joey Matthews are headed in, and there has been considerable talk of bringing in Josh Wilcox, the former Saints footballer who did the angle with Dreamer and Rhodes in New Orleans. WCW. Top 3 matches for Uncensored on March 19th in Miami are Vicious vs. Jarrett for the WCW title, Hogan vs. Flair in a strap match, Sting vs. Luger, Mamalukes vs. Harris Twins for the tag titles, Vampiro vs. Finlay, and Rhodes vs. Funk. Nitro in Minneapolis at the Target Center drew 4,638, paying $126,355. Vito and Johnny kept the tag titles, beating Lane and Idol in 3:32 when Vito pinned Idol after the DDT. It was dead until Miss Hancock came out to dance on the table. Everybody but Vito stopped wrestling to stare at her, which allowed Vito to hit his move. The Harris Twins did the H-bomb on Johnny and Disco. They started talking. God is pushing them a bad idea. The music played in the middle of their interview, so they just stopped talking. Bagwell tried to hit on Liz. She shot him down. Ricky Rackman was back doing on-campus video packages every Monday until spring break. Boy, are those ratings killers. Hogan did an interview on video, and was he booed out of the building or what? He's so 80s. Hogan came out with his belt. Then Flair came out with an identical belt. I know he could have 2 of them, but this is wrestling, and if Hogan isn't selling that Flair stole his prized belt, then who the hell cares? Mr. Duck Lips came out and challenged Sting and Bagwell. Hennig came out and claimed he was Minnesota's greatest athlete. That stuff only works when you're a main eventer. Hennig said if he didn't win the match, he'd streak naked down Hennepin Avenue. Thankfully this is WCW, where no stipulations are never adhered to. Booker no contest Kidman in 1:30 when the Harris Twins ran in and gave H-bombs to both guys. This was about the time I was thinking of asking for my release. They showed a video of Arnold Schwarzenegger from the Arnold Classic, and they had this guy with the hugest arms I've ever seen. They said 28 inches. Usually when claims are made like that, they are totally full of it, but after seeing him, that number may be accurate. He makes 4x4 or Cassius, who are the same person, although nobody cares about that, and Scott Reed Steiner looks small. Anyway, WCW has already signed this guy and are planning a major push for him. And he must be steroid-free because you have to pass a drug test before you sign your WCW contract. 3 Count won the hardcore title, beating Knobs in 3:02 when all 3 pinned him after garbage can lid shots. This was terrible because Knobs wasn't selling anything 3-on-1. Great, we've got 3 guys who hold a singles title. And they wonder why people say their product sucks? Rhodes beat Smiley with a clothesline off the top in 2:49. Bad match. All through the show they asked people who they thought would win between Abbott and Sid. Almost everyone said Sid. Those deals where they ask everyone, if done right, can really build anticipation, but this is WCW. Nobody knew what to say and most of them asked didn't seem like they cared. And nobody at home thought this was any kind of a big match because Abbott never beat anyone. Jarrett beat Vampiro in a US title match in 5:02. Harris twins came out but Sid chased them. The bell rang once by accident in this match when Jarrett had a pin. Finally he used the stroke. This was as good as anything got on this show, which is faint praise because it wasn't good either. The best thing on the show is the announcers put Vampiro over huge. Finlay attacked Vampiro after the match again. They showed a video package asking fans about Sid versus Tank. Everyone cheered for Sid and nobody for Tank. Tony Schiavone came out of the feature saying that fans were split down the middle. David Flair danced with the Nitro girls. Daphne got jealous but they made up before the match. Artist kept the Cruiserweight title pinning David in 2:11 with the closest he's come to actually hitting that leaping DDT. David is so awful. Crowbar interfered and did commentary. They showed Sid KO'd and a guitar by him. So they didn't even have Sid take the shot. Well, he did have a concussion the last time. Isn't it amazing that people like Mike Tenay and Moolah take guitar shots and aren't hurt but these 300-pound guys are all on the DL from the same shots? Miller did an interview and Maestro came out. Maestro pinned Miller in a match with no heat in 1:06. They played 3-count song and Maestro hit Miller with the boombox. Flair pinned Hennig with a low blow after a ref bump and Luger's interference in 3:39. It was okay. It got the most heat. Bagwell beat Luger via DQ in 4:40 when Flair interfered clipping Bagwell. Match was bad but the crowd got into it. They doubled on Luger until Sting made the save. Sting's run-in didn't get much of a reaction. Finally, Vicious beat Tank with one of the worst crossfaces in history in 3:56. It seemed like 15 minutes. Actually they lucked out because this was better than you'd have any right to expect from such a matchup. Abbott spent the whole match punching Sid's ribs which he had taped, never going after his head, where he was supposedly knocked silly earlier in the show. Sid made the Superman comeback, missed to submission, but Abbott tapped anyway. I hope they realize that Abbott is now dead for life. There was talk that even after this they could rebuild Abbott for a Goldberg feud and even Starrcade, but they might as well bring in Dan Severn for all the money that's going to draw now. For those interested in useless knowledge, even though Hogan said the strap match would be a Yapapa Indian strap match 19 times during his promo, the correct name of the tribe is Yavapai. After Nitro went off the air on February 21st, Hogan was still selling the bat shot from Luger. They took Dillinger out on a stretcher and then Hogan got up and started doing his posing routine. When they showed the ad for DDP's book and on the screen it read role model, people in the building started laughing like it was a comedy spot like the Cat Bow commercial. The original plan for that show was for Sid versus Jarrett to be in a cage and Hogan versus Flair to be the semifinal. Hogan was upset when they canceled the Vicious match and put him in the cage match single main event, because he knew the eyes would be on him when they didn't draw a rating. Not sure whose decision it was to change his opponent from Flair to Luger. Regarding Hogan, apparently the company has resigned itself that for the next 2 years, due to him being under contract with creative control of his programs, they basically have to cater to his whims. You can just imagine how much more damage will be done with 2 more years of what has been failing for the past year of nosediving. Hogan may have already topped Triple H's McMahon may not hire Goldberg if he was available in McMahon's own comparing Colette Foley to Robin Gibbons, and then doing a 180 the next week, in the most inane quote of the early year when he claimed that all the top guys in the WWF that can draw money are between the ages of 35 and 40. Aside from Undertaker, who is 37 and also hasn't been around in months, and Austin, who also hasn't been around in months, and Foley at 34, none of the WWF's current headliners are even approaching 35. Thunder taped February 22nd in Reno, Nevada was a slight improvement over most recent WCW fare. Finlay pinned Karagias with a tombstone after laying out the other members of 3 Count as well with garbage can lid shots. Bagwell tried to hit on Daphne. Man, you know you're pathetic when you're shot down by Daphne, even in storyline form. Flair did an interview and challenged anyone. Vampiro came out and Flair did a good job building heat for a match that there was no storyline for up to that point. La Parka did an interview where they had the guy jive talking English while Parka just stood there. Actually I thought Parka and Gene Okerlund were hilarious in this skit. Nash spent the whole show with amnesia thinking he was Commissioner Gordon. It was the worst acted stuff imaginable, particularly the nurses, even more than Nash. There were two funny things. When he called for Bruce Wayne, he got Ralphus, who came in and Nash thought he was Bruce. The other was when Batman hadn't shown up, but Nash saw Sid on TV and thought the Joker had escaped. One of the nurses suggested calling Superman, and that nurse must have had Rena Marrow's dialogue coach, and Nash responded that Superman was a fake comic book character. Aside from that, the skits were terrible, in particular with Nash trying to sing Bingo. Park a pin Berlin in 102. Whatever happened to Uta Ludendorff? Abbott did an interview and the former Virgil Vincent Shane, etc. came out and said his real name was Mike Jones. Bagwell beat David Flair in 226 with a reverse DDT. Maestro and Symphony came out and Maestro attacked Bagwell after the match. Bagwell treated Flair as if he was a joke. Then again, in the ring he is. Abbott knocked out Jones in 57. Flair pinned Vampiro in 541. Good match. Flair did a great job of putting Vampiro over and the announcers were selling that this was Vampiro's greatest moment for all it was worth. The problem is to do a scenario like that, you either need a lot more time to build the drama, or a better finish. It was the best thing they've done with Vampiro so far, but it was still overplayed, like they were shoving this idea that they didn't give enough time to execute properly down your throat with the commentary. Luger hit Vampiro in the legs with the bat and Flair beat him with the figure 4. After the match, Flair and Luger beat on him and Flair whipped him with the Hogan belt. Later in the show they announced a reverse decision. If this builds to something where Flair now challenges him for him claiming a win over him and then Flair can't beat him again, they do a time limit draw for instance, Vampiro will be elevated by this program and he at least shows potential for being able to get over. If it's dropped and Vampiro is booked in the same positions as before, the next time the announcers try to elevate someone in commentary, as they tried with Kidman a few weeks back after Sold Out, the fans will react as if someone has cried wolf one too many times. In the dressing room after, Finlay jumped Vampiro as well, which is not exactly the way to elevate Vampiro to lock him in with a guy who will never be considered a top guy no matter how great a worker he was in his day. Dustin Rhodes did a really strong heel interview. Funk was on the video screen and also did a good promo. For this 5 minutes it was almost like watching a real wrestling company. Artist kept the Cruiserweight title beating Crowbar in 346 when he again missed his finisher. Daphne in a purple wig was hitting on Artist, which led to a catfight spot with Paisley. There's an angle waiting to be done with these two, but they've already got the physical before the verbal, so it's ass backwards booking. Wall pinned Disco in 141 with a choke slam. Before it started, Lane and Idol attacked the Marmadukes. Harris twins beat Booker and Kidman in 326 when they did the H-bomb on Booker. What a waste pushing the Harris twins. Vicious beat Luger via DQ in a title match in 344. It wasn't as terrible as it sounds on paper. Flair interfered and Vicious was holding his own with both of them. It was funny because Charles Robinson freaked when Sid went to choke slam his idol. Later in the segment, after Flair and Luger took over when Luger hit Vicious in the knees with the bat, Flair decked Robinson anyway. Jarrett and the Harris twins wanted to join in the run-in but WCW security stopped them. The show ended with Jarrett hitting Mickey J with a guitar. The situation with Abbott and the knife is that before the match, Abbott asked Sullivan if it would be okay to use a weapon in the match. Sullivan, thinking like a pro wrestler, said it was okay. Abbott, thinking like someone who fights in bars, took another meaning to the word weapon and pulled out the knife. Shuvani actually tried to get around it by saying it was scissors and he was going to cut Big Al's beard, although Big Al didn't have a beard, but he's still being praised internally for fast thinking on his feet. Abbott's stock within the company really dropped from the incident, which probably led to the decision to do the Sid deal, and soured a lot of people on the original idea for Goldberg vs. Abbott as the Starrcade main event. There were booking meetings late in the week because Brad Siegel wanted WCW to have a battle plan to turn the company around and something substantial for when Goldberg returns. The basic gist of how they wanted to heat up Goldberg was for him to plow through everyone, including some major faces turning heel on him. Among those, Sonny Ono is trying to recruit as part of the racial discrimination lawsuit against WCW are Super Colo, Lizmark Jr., Damien, Cyclope, and Hector Garza. Damien and Cyclope have already spoken with Ono's lawyers while they are trying to get in touch with the other three. The realization is that Bobby Walker and Harrison Norris have no track record of being stars anywhere, while the Mexicans were stars in their native country who were jobbers in the US because they were buried from day one. In the case of Garza, more than the other four who were never huge national stars in Mexico, although Lismark Jr. was close and did main event while Colo was a very popular mid-carder during the AAA heyday, there is a strong case because he was a superstar in his native country and was marketable. There were people in the company when he first arrived who thought he was going to be a major superstar because of how much charisma and crowd reaction he got at some house shows before he was ever pushed on television, and people really weren't that aware of his Mexican stardom. Then, within 2 weeks, the booking committee buried him in a jobber role. I'm not convinced Garza would have made it because he had a style clash in the ring with American workers that, unlike some of the others, he didn't ever fully work his way through, but the fact is he was buried long before any of that came to the fore, and maybe it was part of the reason he didn't work harder to assimilate like Mysterio Jr. and Guerrero did. Ono has already told people he has done an interview for the TV show 2020 regarding this lawsuit. Thunderbolt Patterson, who filed a famous racial discrimination lawsuit against Jim Barnett and Jim Crockett Jr., considers Bobby Walker like an adopted son, commented regarding these suits in a Mike Mooneyham story in the Charleston Post-Courier on February 20th. Patterson said, "They may have some things, but there are really no merits of where they're coming from. It's amazing how they don't contact me. They need a little more meat than that. I took him, Walker, there to it. They won't come and stand up about the real problem. They're just experiencing a little piece of it. They may get a few dollars, but what will that do? Nothing's ever going to change." Funk was actually not at Thunder in Reno, and his interview with Rhodes was pre-taped the previous night. He went to Philadelphia for a court case involving a lawsuit from the famous fire incident of many years back where a fan got burned, but the case was postponed until late March. Tori Wilson is on the cover of the April issue of the bodybuilding magazine Iron Man, including a story. Sting was supposed to come to Nitro on February 21st after the pay-per-view, but simply refused to come, which is why he has so much heat internally. He's supposed to be back full-time wrestling starting with the pay-per-view. Scott Steiner will now be brought back in late March. Curt Hennig hadn't been around because his daughter was in rough shape, including at one point being in a coma from a skiing accident about a month back. Bagwell is claiming on his website that he's demanding to be paid what he's worth by WCW, or that on March 1st he's going to ask for his release. I'm not sure what the going rate these days is for a 1.97 quarter, but it sounds to me like he's asking for a pay cut. Hall was going to be fired after Super Brawl but wasn't due to the timing of his injury. It is said to be a bruised spine, and you can imagine the skepticism, with the big question being, can you work 2 days in ICU? Which is really the crux of the debates between people who believe it was a work and people who believe it wasn't. And there are those who believe he went into the match with the injury, kept it quiet, and waited for the moment to sell it. It is expected there will be some form of discipline sent his way once he's deemed no longer injured. Steve Borden Sting was ripped in the February 25th USA Today for his performance in Shutter Speed. The story said, "There was some camp pleasure in watching Borden and Daisy Fuentes struggle with the none too taxing demands of the script, but not enough to keep you around for 2 hours." Goldberg was brought to Reno because there are licensees that are unhappy with the ratings drop, and there is fear of them dropping the product. The company has claimed the low ratings are because so many of the top guys are out with injuries, and while there is truth to there being a ton of injuries, there always will be with morale the way it is, and if Hogan and Flair's return didn't mean squat, it isn't like anyone will care when DDP or Sting gets healthy. Goldberg meant more to ratings than anyone last year, but on a 2-hour show, nobody by themselves means even a 0.1 in the overall number. Goldberg was telling friends that in 2 months things were going to be different. Chris Candido and Tammy Sytch officially got their release from ECW and are expected to start here imminently. The reason the 3-count versus Smiley and Lane and Idol match ended up as a 3-on-2 on February 14th Nitro from Nassau Coliseum is because Idol's blood pressure was too high in his checkup, and the New York State Athletic Commission wouldn't allow him to wrestle. Thunder on February 22nd in Reno, Nevada drew 3,777, paying $66,866. The February 26th debut in Winnipeg drew 6,683, paying $196,026. House show February 27th in Duluth, Minnesota drew 2,079, paying $43,657. Bret Hart was brought to Winnipeg and gave a speech in the ring. Hart played total face, and was knocked by Jarrett in a later interview when Jarrett ripped on the fans mentioning Hart's comments. "I guess we could say if anyone took storylines seriously that means Hart and Jarrett aren't together in the NWO, but this being wrestling, I don't think anyone was looking past the momentary pop." Winnipeg had the main event changed several times, from Hart vs. Benoit, which virtually all the tickets were purchased for, to Sid vs. Benoit, to Sid vs. Hall, before finally ending up as Sid vs. Luger. Duluth had Sid pinning Luger in a short match with a powerbomb and Jarrett beating Vampiro when the Harris twins interfered. Hennig was back since they were in his neck of the woods and pinned Bagwell. In the opener, Artist actually pinned Kidman in a cruiserweight title match, which contradicts a TV storyline of them pushing so hard that Kidman is no longer in that division. Not to mention Kidman's big push actually wound up with him jobbing for Artist in house show openers. Of course, doing jobs is no big deal. And of course Kidman should be wrestling as a cruiserweight if the division hadn't been demeaned and destroyed, and of course a champion should win to make titles mean something, but of course your TV storylines should also apply to the product as a whole. Another strange result, considering who gets pushed on TV and who doesn't, is that Rick Steiner and Mike Rotunda with Leia Meow beat the Harris twins. WWF Raw on February 28 in Madison Square Garden drew a sellout 12,256, paying $379,462. It was the worst Raw in a long time. Triple H did an interview and showed a video tribute to Foley, which mainly consisted of him in embarrassing situations. Shane came out with show. Rock came out and guaranteed he'd win the title at Mania. Triple H told Rock he had to start from the bottom with a match with Brooklyn Brawler. Hardys beat Acolytes in 3:59 when Matt pinned Bradshaw after a neckbreaker. This was the best match on the show. Rikishi beat Angle via countout in 1:41 in a European title match when Angle just walked out after Rikishi rubbed his butt in Angle's face. Jericho and Chyna came out as Angle was leaving and threw him back in for the Rikishi piledriver and Banzai. Jericho and Chyna then danced with Rikishi and Too Cool. Chyna looked like she was having fun for once in the ring, but she can't dance at all. Christian and Edge beat Snow and Blackman in 3:23 when Christian hit a missile dropkick on Blackman, who fell into Edge's spear for the pin. Terry Botrite distracted Bradshaw at the finish. Rock beat Brawler in 30 with the Rock Bottom. Rock challenged Triple H. Shane McMahon came out and said if Rock could win a handicap match over Show and Triple H, he'd get the title shot at Mania. Jericho beat Saturn in 3:03 when Chyna hit him with a low blow and Jericho used a quebrada. Malenko had attacked Chyna first. Match was a disappointment as Saturn is trying to fit into the WWF style of using a lot of punches, and as the Broken Record says, it's the worst part of his game. The rest of DX beat up Gunn backstage since he's out for a few months. The last time they tried to go with Gunn as a single, it was a miserable failure to the point they put the Outlaws back together in such a rush they didn't even bother coming out with a storyline. One day they were feuding, then they were a team. Crash Holly and C. Henry in a hardcore match in 2 minutes. Mae Young gave Crash the worst big splash ever, and then went into labor. They had her backstage with an EMT, Patterson, Briscoe, Henry and Moolah for this god-awful segment that ended when they pulled a hand out of her. I had no idea what this was. Luckily I do a radio show and someone explained that hands were popular sex toys in the 70s and 80s for women, and I guess the idea was she was getting herself off in another decade and it had been there for a while. Taz beat Benoit in 2:02 when Albert and Bossman interfered for the DQ. Very disappointing because of the run-in immediately when Taz got the choke. There was a loud ECW chant. Guerrero kept distracting the ref. Boy, was Benoit portrayed as nothing special here. Tim White threw Guerrero out. They kept the gimmick where Taz gets killed but he keeps coming back. Dudley's kept tag titles against Road Dogg and X-Pac when Kane came out in 4:39 and choke slammed everyone but X-Pac, who ran away. They showed a great Foley tribute video. Rock beat Show and Triple H via DQ in 6:54. There was little heat in this match. Rock hit the rock bottom on Triple H and People's Elbow when Shane interfered for the DQ. Shane gave Rock a low blow and fans chanted for Foley to save, but instead Show choke slammed Rock and the show ended. A storyline that a lot of people are expecting is that Vince returns and helps Rock win a match and get into WrestleMania as a three-way, with Vince with Rock, Shane with Show and Stephanie with Triple H, and the winner gets control of the company and the WWF title. Which sounds like a good scenario. I think it's pretty clear that either Vince or Foley will somehow be involved in getting Rock into the Mania main event, and Foley will almost surely play a hand in screwing over Triple H at some point upon his return. Thunder taped February 22nd in Nashville was another excellent show paced by the Foley interview. The show opened with Crash Holly winning the hardcore title from Test. Show came out and did an interview and logically asked why the fans didn't like him, actually making valid points. They kept showing clips of Rock's feet hitting the ground first. Angle came out and agreed with him. Jericho and Chyna, who looked really weird up close I guess from the makeup job, before Rock came out and mocked him to set up the tag main event. They did an awesome video package intertwining the Michaels vs. Undertaker and Mankind vs. Undertaker Hell in a Cell matches. Somehow they forgot to put in clips from the Undertaker vs. Bossman match. Kane double count out Benoit in 2:15. Kane no-sold the diving headbutt and then they messed up a spinning backbreaker spot. Tori came out and slapped Paul Bearer. Bearer went after her. I'm still waiting for the explanation why Bearer and Kane are together, but I guess sometimes you have to pretend you're watching WCW. Benoit went after him to allow Tori to lure X-Pac to the back where X-Pac shot him in the face with China's bazooka gun. This was pretty funny because live they had one of those deals that only happens to WCW on live shows, but lucky for them it was on tape, as the gun didn't go off. Later in the show they redid the same angle and the gun went off and Kane ended up with fire in the face. Saturn and Malenko and Blackman and Snow beat Edge and Christian and Hardys when Saturn pinned Jeff after a tiger suplex in 3:09. After the match the Hardys and Edge and Christian did the slow burn and ended up wailing on each other. X-Pac and Triple H and Road Dogg beat Rikishi and Too Cool in 6 minutes when X-Pac pinned Sexay with the X-Factor in a hot match. Godfather and Brown beat Albert and Bossman in 2:34 when Godfather pinned Albert with what they once again called the pimp drop. They hadn't referred to Godfather as a pimp on SmackDown in some time. My feeling is Brown in his Godfather Jr. role isn't a good fit and he's floundering, although they weren't doing much with him beforehand either. Taz did a run-in on Albert leading to the finish. Foley then did one of the greatest interviews in the history of wrestling. He talked about his career, talked about the Ali Frazier thriller in Manila, talked about his accomplishments in his life, his legitimate injuries from the Hell in a Cell match, and hinted without saying goodbye, all with amazing conviction. I'm not saying it was ruined, because he could have gotten amnesia and started chanting bingo after finishing, and it still wouldn't have been ruined, but it wasn't help doing that serious interview you can believe it and then doing that phony arrest thing after. It took all the serious intensity out of the build-up that he instilled by basically swearing he wasn't going to retire and come back and prostitute himself, and that all he had was his word and talking about his legitimate injuries and the last time he was in the Hell in a Cell, and turned it into typical pro wrestling with the arrest in Shark Cage. And does anyone think the silliness got one more person to order the pay-per-view or caused one person not to switch the channel? Sometimes in wrestling they luck into something or just come up because of a performance on something that isn't just good, but great, and they take down its potential effects by coding it in typical wrestling when sometimes atypical is better. It didn't help that Stephanie McMahon's delivery was just awful as compared with the speech Foley gave moments earlier, and they were now part of the same angle. Gunn beat Bubba Ray Dudley in 2:06 when Devon interfered for the DQ. It was one of those nights where Billy was slightly off on everything. After the match, Road Dogg made the save and it ended with Billy giving Bubba Famouser through a table. Angle and Show beat Jericho and Rock via DQ in 4:02 when Chyna interfered. They continued to brawl after the match. Jericho vs. Angle was a disappointment as they just didn't click. Show after the match threw Rock through a window. The show ended with the DX bus dragging the cage Foley was in. They had fake police, who on the show were guys masquerading as police as opposed to the usual pro wrestling guys masquerading as police arrest him and put him in a small fake cell behind the DX bus, claiming they were dragging him to Hartford. WrestleMania will be an expanded 12-hour pay-per-view package for $49.95 along with the 3-hour actual show for $34.95. The 12-hour show will consist of an 8-hour pregame show and a 1-hour postgame show. Anyone who buys the 12-hour package will also get a Best of WrestleMania home video. Both Rock and Foley's book were still high on the charts, with Rock's book as high as #1 on some charts as late as the weekend of February 20th, of nonfiction bestsellers over the past 2 weeks. The Village Voice on February 29th made fun of the Newsweek article on pro wrestling for saying how the article waited 2,000 words before even mentioning almost in passing that its stock price has lagged lately. They mockingly gave writer John Leland and the magazine's editorial staff their award for bad journalism for the headline that states, "It may look like a cartoon spectacle, but WWF is serious business. And business is good." They ripped on the last line saying that when the stock drops from $34 per share as it's open to the public to just over $11 in just a few months that business isn't so good. Actually the knock is a cheap shot, because profitability, house shows, ratings, advertising, merchandising are all really good. Where they have a point is that in any story right now proclaiming McMahon's strengths as an entertainment producer or wrestling promoter, there is a very important point of his major weaknesses in his new role as the head of a publicly traded company, his inability to avoid bad publicity and his confrontational methods of handling it, which only serves to make it worse, starting with putting out that press release about Coke, later his attacks on the PTC, on the investment analysts and his own caricature-like performance at the XFL press conference have been the reasons people in the investment world have reacted to him this way even with record profits. Benoit on his website wrote, "In the last 4 years of my career, I have seen the fans get shafted innumerable times on potentially great matches due to an ugly word called ego. I can go on and on talking about different events and times, but what I really want to address here regards someone who should stand out as an inspiration, a role model and a leader in the dressing room: Hulk Hogan. Here is a guy that would show up and disappear into his locker room, which had a do not enter sign posted outside of it, concerning himself with only how many segments he had, what hours they were on, and which segments were before and after his. He would walk around, when he did step out of his confines, with his cocky arrogance as if he were the king and we, the paupers. From what I hear, not much has changed. My question is, what kind of legacy do you want to leave behind? Don't you think it's time you start to make a positive difference behind the scenes? Lead, follow, or get out of the way. Leave the ego at home and start making some real contributions to the business and to the fans that made you." Hogan was on Bubba the Love Sponge on February 24th and claimed that he thought Benoit was a top talent, and of the 4 guys who left, he was a real loss, and claimed, "And anyone who followed WCW will get a great laugh out of this," that he always spoke up for Benoit, always wanted him to get a bigger push and more TV time, but the people in power had always wanted to bury him. Since Saturn ripped on Hogan for similar things, Hogan's comeback was that he'll make more money this year than Saturn will make in the next 10 years. Rock will tape an episode of TSN's Off the Record on March 2nd, while Val Venus and Trish Stratus tape on March 3rd. No word on air dates for either show. The February 13th Boston Globe ran a lengthy sociological story regarding the WWF and pro wrestling, headlining by saying the problem is not that pro wrestling makes boys violent. The real lesson of the wildly popular pseudo-sport is more insidious. It suggests pro wrestling is something aimed to white men and boys and talks about the value structures it espouses in its plotlines while aiming as the base instinct of that audience in particular might makes right and extreme violence, defining how power is exercised. It says previous discussions about wrestling's effect on viewers center around if it leads to violence or causes imitative violence, but the story said that misses the point. The point isn't if kids imitate the violence, but do they learn that taunting, ridiculing and bullying, as well as verbal aggression toward women, are portrayed as cool masculine traits. It brought up a study of kids in grades 4 through 6 in the Boston area, finding 10% saying they were bullied at least once per week and 20% claiming they were bullies. They also called Godfather one of the most overtly racist and sexist characterization on contemporary television, and mentioning him as one of the few black figures in wrestling. The article also exposed wrestling's latest promotional con, noting that McMahon likes to egg on the criticism to instill the idea that his company is rebellious, and then noted the values, such as the treatment of women and the homophobia, are actually more conservative values, and that it allows men to appear powerful by valuing a repressive gender order. Chris Benoit and Nancy had their first child at 3 a.m. on February 25th, a 9-pound, 9-ounce baby boy named Daniel Christopher Benoit. They had been in the hospital for 2 days to induce labor since she was already overdue. We're told there were never any talks of Shawn Michaels being paired with Trish Stratus or of Michaels appearing at the TV tapings this past week. Speaking of Stratus, she was the pin-up sunshine girl in the February 28th Toronto Sun and is on the cover of the May issue of Muscle Mag International. Rock may be up for a part in the movie Mummy 2. USA Today reported that a new league which would be a direct challenge in the spring to the XFL was having a meeting next month called the Fan Football League, FFL, as it regards WrestleMania. They are hopeful of Austin being involved in the show. It depends if he's healthy enough to at least deliver a stunner. There's little chance of him doing a match, and they don't want him to do a run-in unless he can at least do his move. Undertaker will probably be back on the show, although also probably not in a wrestling capacity. Foley watched the 2020 piece a second time and, according to those with him, said upon a second viewing he didn't think it was a negative piece toward him and wasn't unhappy with it. Chyna will be shooting a few more episodes of Third Rock from the Sun in upcoming weeks, so she'll be missing several shows. The episodes are scheduled for airing in April and May, including a probable appearance on the season finale with William Shatner. WWF The Music Volume 4 with a renewed TV push fell to number 133 on the charts with 13,681 units sold. On the Rec Sports video charts, WWF occupies the top 6 slots with Rock at number 1, followed by Austin vs. McMahon, Best of Raw, Austin Hell Yeah, Armageddon and Triple H and Chyna. WWF has 14 of the top 20 videos, while WCW has Sting at number 19 as its only entrant. The WWF pulled Rock from the Off the Record show this week, and they are taping 2 shows this week with WWF talent, one with Val Venus and Trish Stratus, and the other with Christian. SmackDown on February 22nd in Nashville drew a sellout 12,950, paying $366,858. House Show on February 23rd in Little Rock, Arkansas drew 15,892, paying $462,654. Little Rock was headlined by Rockover Bossman, and from several different reports the atmosphere was electric all night long. Merchandise not including the pay-per-view show was $295,742 or $7.20 per head. Whether it's the clash of titans in the ring or the drama that unfolds outside it, we're here to break it down, match by match, feud by feud. Remember, in the world of wrestling, every day is a battle, and every victory is a story waiting to be told. Until next time, keep the passion alive, and never stop wrestling with the possibilities. This is the Pro Wrestle Machine,